Welcome to War Sleep Stories. Today, we will be listening to relaxing war stories and sounds to make you fall asleep, but before that, kindly like and subscribe. Thank you. Operation Ortsac. In the humid heat of a Caribbean October in 1962, the world stood on the brink of chaos. It was a time when the Cold War wasn't just cold, it was frozen, brittle, and ready to shatter at the slightest touch. The island of Cuba, just 90 miles from the coast of Florida, became the stage for an unfolding drama that would bring humanity closer to the precipice of nuclear annihilation than ever before. High above the Earth, U-2 reconnaissance planes soared, their cameras capturing grainy but unmistakable images of something sinister. Rows of long, cylindrical objects rested on makeshift launch pads in Cuban fields. These weren't ordinary weapons, they were Soviet R-12 Divina missiles capable of delivering nuclear warheads deep into American territory. The photographs, analyzed by intelligence experts in Washington, sent shockwaves through the halls of power. President John F. Kennedy stared at the stark images laid before him in the Oval Office. His face was calm, but his mind raced. This wasn't just a matter of missiles, it was a challenge to the very balance of global power. The Soviet Union had taken a bold and provocative step, and Kennedy knew that how he responded would determine the course of history. Far away in Moscow, Premier Nikita Khrushchev played a dangerous game. His decision to place nuclear weapons in Cuba was a move to counterbalance U.S. missiles in Turkey and to support Fidel Castro's fledgling communist regime. For Khrushchev, it was a gamble that might tip the scales of Cold War geopolitics in his favor or bring everything crashing down. As the days passed, a cloak of secrecy enveloped the White House. The world had no inkling of the storm brewing behind closed doors. Military advisors debated options ranging from airstrikes to a full-scale invasion of Cuba. Among these plans was Operation Ortsac, a meticulously devised blueprint for the invasion and overthrow of Castro's government. The name, Castro spelled backward, hinted at its audacious intent. The first steps toward war had been sketched out. Little did the world know, a single decision would soon determine whether humanity would wake to a new dawn or plunge into an endless night. As October's days rolled forward, the U.S. military machinery whirred into action. Operation Ortsac was drawn from the depths of contingency plans that envisioned an amphibious assault on Cuban shores. Generals and admirals huddled in the Pentagon's secure war rooms, tracing maps of the island with practiced precision. They marked key airfields, coastal defenses, and missile sites, targets that would determine the operation's success or failure. The 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions were assigned pivotal roles. Their orders were clear: secure strategic airfields at Jose Marti and San Antonio de los Baños, cutting Cuba off from potential reinforcements. Simultaneously, the 1st and 2nd Marine Divisions would storm the beaches at Tarara, establishing a beachhead to pave the way for heavier forces. The plan was bold, decisive, and perilously close to ignition. The soldiers, sailors, and airmen tasked with carrying out this operation trained with a somber intensity. In the Florida Keys, they rehearsed beach landings and jungle warfare, each drill a reminder of the stakes. For many, this wasn't just another exercise. They knew that once the order came, the chaos of war would follow. In Havana, Fidel Castro braced his nation for the possibility of invasion. Cuban militia forces drilled tirelessly, their morale buoyed by defiance. Castro's speeches, fiery and unyielding, echoed across the island, rallying his people against what he painted as imperial aggression. The Soviet advisors embedded in Cuba worked feverishly to ready the missile sites for operation, their movements shadowed by the growing presence of American reconnaissance. The stage was set. Both sides stared across the abyss of war, their resolve tested by the unknown. The men and women at the heart of this storm prepared for what seemed inevitable, yet few could truly fathom the consequences of what might come next. On October 22, President Kennedy addressed the nation in a broadcast that froze hearts worldwide. He revealed the presence of Soviet missiles in Cuba and declared a naval quarantine to prevent further shipments of military equipment to the island. The word quarantine was chosen carefully. It was less provocative than blockade, a term that could legally justify war. The quarantine line stretched across the Caribbean, enforced by U.S. Navy warships. The sight of American destroyers and aircraft carriers patrolling the turquoise waters was a show of force designed to send an unambiguous message to Moscow. Soviet vessels carrying military supplies now faced a stark choice: turn back or risk confrontation. For the sailors on those ships, the tension was palpable. Every radar blip and sonar ping could signal the beginning of hostilities. On the USS Joseph P. Kennedy Jr., Captain John G. McCain III ordered his crew to maintain readiness at all times. The men moved with a quiet efficiency, aware that a single misstep could ignite a conflict beyond comprehension. In the Kremlin, Khrushchev weighed his options. He could order his ships to breach the quarantine and risk a direct clash with the U.S. Navy, or he could seek a diplomatic solution. The clock was ticking, and every passing hour brought the world closer to a breaking point. Meanwhile, in Washington, the National Security Council deliberated over contingency plans. Operation Ortsac remained on the table, but Kennedy was cautious. The young president, acutely aware of the fragility of peace, sought a resolution that would avoid bloodshed. Yet, as tensions escalated, the specter of war loomed ever larger. The Caribbean became a chessboard for high-stakes diplomacy, and every move carried the weight of a world on edge. As Soviet freighters approached the quarantine line, the American Navy prepared for a potential showdown. Orders were clear: any ship refusing inspection would be intercepted. On October 24th, a Soviet ship named the Meryusiale became the first to be boarded. The freighter's crew, tense but cooperative, allowed U.S. personnel to search their cargo. It carried no military equipment. Across the world, people exhaled, but the crisis was far from over. Soviet ships carrying missiles were still en route, and their intentions remained uncertain. In Havana, Fidel Castro seethed. He viewed the quarantine as a direct affront to Cuban sovereignty, a prelude to invasion. Soviet advisors reassured him that Moscow would not abandon Cuba, but their words offered little comfort. Meanwhile, Cuban forces prepared for an assault they believed could come any day. Anti-aircraft batteries bristled with readiness, and militias patrolled the beaches, their rifles gleaming under the tropical sun. In Washington, Kennedy and his advisors walked a tightrope. Some urged an immediate airstrike, fearing that delays would allow the missiles to become fully operational. Others advocated diplomacy, believing a military conflict could spiral into nuclear war. The president, calm but resolute, leaned toward negotiation, knowing that the world watched his every move. As the sun set on October 24th, the quarantine line held firm, but the tension remained unbroken. In the quiet moments before sleep, millions prayed for peace, while the men and women on the front line steeled themselves for the unknown. On October 26th, the first glimmers of a potential resolution emerged. A letter arrived from Khrushchev, addressed to Kennedy. It was personal, almost pleading, and offered a way out of the crisis. Khrushchev proposed that the Soviet Union would remove its missiles from Cuba if the U.S. promised not to invade the island. The letter brought a flicker of hope to the White House, but even as diplomats worked behind the scenes, a second letter arrived the following day. This one was harsher in tone, demanding that the U.S. also remove its missiles from Turkey in exchange for Soviet concessions. The conflicting messages sowed confusion and mistrust among Kennedy's advisors. While Washington deliberated, events on the ground threatened to escalate. On October 27, a U.S. U-2 reconnaissance plane was shot down over Cuba, killing its pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson Jr. The incident nearly shattered the fragile diplomacy in progress. The Joint Chiefs of Staff urged immediate retaliation, but Kennedy held firm, refusing to be drawn into a hasty response. In Moscow, Khrushchev wrestled with his own pressures. Hardliners within the Soviet government pushed for a stronger stance, But the premier knew that a miscalculation could lead to catastrophe. The weight of the world bore down on two men, separated by oceans yet bound by the shared responsibility of preventing annihilation. As night fell on October 27, the crisis teetered on the edge of disaster. Yet, amid the uncertainty, both sides clung to the hope that reason would prevail. The morning of October 28 dawned with a message from Khrushchev broadcast over Radio Moscow. He announced that the Soviet Union would remove its missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade the island. Behind closed doors, a secret agreement had been reached. The U.S. would also quietly remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey within months. The announcement brought relief to a world that had held its breath for 13 harrowing days. In the streets of Washington, Moscow, and cities around the globe, people rejoiced. Yet, for those directly involved, the end of the crisis was bittersweet. The cost of brinkmanship had been high, and the scars would linger. In Havana, Castro felt betrayed. The resolution had been reached without his input, leaving him with a deep distrust of both the Soviets and the Americans. Cuban forces remained on high alert, their leader determined to defend his revolution at any cost. For the men who had trained for Operation Ortsak, the conclusion of the crisis brought a strange mix of emotions. Relief at avoiding war was tempered by the sobering reality of how close they had come. On the beaches of Florida and aboard ships in the Caribbean, soldiers packed their gear, wondering what might have been. As the world began to exhale, the Cuban Missile Crisis became a sobering reminder of humanity's capacity for destruction and the fragile threads that hold peace together. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended, but the echoes of those 13 days reverberated across the globe. For the American military, Operation Ortsak was shelved, but its detailed planning left an imprint on future strategies. Lessons learned from the crisis reshaped the approach to Cold War conflicts, emphasizing the balance between strength and diplomacy. In the barracks and aboard ships, soldiers who had trained for the invasion returned to their routines. For many, there was relief. Yet some couldn't shake the tension of what they had prepared for: a full-scale invasion of a nation fortified and ready for war. Stories circulated about the training exercises, the coded plans, and the unspoken fear of facing a nuclear-armed adversary. Cuba, meanwhile, remained on edge. Fidel Castro tightened his grip on the island, fortifying its defenses and ensuring that the revolution's legacy would endure. Soviet advisors left Cuba quietly, their departure marking the end of the missile sites that had brought the world to the brink. For ordinary Cubans, life resumed under the shadow of isolation and embargo, their island a pawn in the chess game of global politics. The crisis also reshaped the relationship between Kennedy and Khrushchev. Both leaders understood how close they had come to disaster, and back-channel communications between Washington and Moscow became a lifeline to prevent future confrontations. The installation of the Moscow-Washington hotline symbolized this newfound caution, a direct link between the two superpowers to bridge the gulf of misunderstanding. In the corridors of power, not everyone was satisfied with the resolution. Hardliners in the Pentagon and the CIA viewed the outcome as a missed opportunity to eliminate Castro and assert U.S. dominance in the hemisphere. Plans to destabilize Cuba continued, often through covert operations. Assassination plots, sabotage missions, and propaganda campaigns became the tools of a prolonged struggle against Castro's regime. Among the military units that had prepared for Ortsak, the sense of unfinished business lingered. Marines who had rehearsed beach landings in Florida recalled the intensity of their preparations, wondering whether they might still be called to action. For the paratroopers of the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions, the long days of readiness felt surreal, in hindsight a chapter of their lives that ended without a climactic moment. Cuban civilians bore the weight of these ongoing tensions. Farmers who had seen Soviet advisors arrive in their villages now adjusted to their absence. Families braced for potential invasions, real or imagined, as rumors of American plans circulated. The embargo deepened economic hardship, fueling both resentment and resilience. For Castro, The end of the crisis was a beginning in its own way. Determined to safeguard Cuba's independence, he expanded his alliances with other socialist nations, sending Cuban troops and advisors to conflicts in Africa and Latin America. To him, the revolution wasn't just about Cuba, it was a global struggle against imperialism. The story of Operation Ortsac became a quiet chapter in Cold War history, overshadowed by the broader narrative of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Yet, within the Pentagon, the operation's plans lived on as a case study. Military strategists dissected the details of the invasion force, the challenges of logistics, and the risks of engaging a nuclear-armed adversary. For the men who had been part of Ortsac's preparations, the memories remained vivid. Captain Mark Sutherland of the 1st Marine Division often reflected on the hours spent briefing his platoon on Cuban terrain. His maps, marked with potential enemy positions, became relics of a mission that never came to pass. He would later say that the tension in those days taught him more about leadership than any battle he had fought. In Havana, young Carlos Mejia, a Cuban militia member, told his grandchildren stories of the days when he stood guard at a missile site. He described the fear of American airstrikes, the camaraderie of his unit, and the pride of defending his homeland. Carlos often wondered if the Americans ever truly understood what their actions meant for ordinary Cubans. The specter of Ortsac lingered, a reminder of how close the world had come to war. As the years passed, those who had lived through the crisis carried its lessons forward, knowing that history, like a coiled spring, could release its tension at any moment. As the Cold War dragged on, the soldiers who had trained for Operation Ortsac found themselves drawn into other conflicts. Vietnam loomed on the horizon, and many of the same airborne and marine divisions prepared for new battles in unfamiliar jungles. The transition was abrupt, but the lessons of readiness from Ortsac lingered in their minds. Lieutenant Paul Grayson of the 82nd Airborne Division had been ready to parachute into Cuba. Now, he prepared his men for the humid heat of Southeast Asia. Paul often thought about how different the Cuban mission might have been. Instead of facing a hostile population armed with Soviet weapons, they were heading into a war of attrition against an enemy who blended into the landscape. He told his men, "What we prepared for in Cuba taught us vigilance, never let your guard down." In Cuba, the militia that had braced for an American invasion began to disband, but not entirely. Castro ensured that his people remained ready, drilling them in guerrilla tactics and instilling a sense of revolutionary duty. Veterans of the Cuban Missile Crisis became instructors, passing down their knowledge to a new generation. Among them was Major Raúl Alvarez, a Soviet-trained officer who had overseen a key missile site. For him, the crisis was proof of Cuba's strength in standing against a superpower. For civilians on both sides, the psychological scars remained. In Miami's Little Havana, Cuban exiles spoke in hushed tones about the crisis, convinced that America's restraint had been a betrayal of their dream to see Castro ousted. Their voices filled the cafes and community centers, mixing hope with bitterness. Amid the grand narratives of leaders and strategies, the silent survivors of the crisis lived their lives quietly. For Major Rudolph Anderson Jr.'s widow, Jane, the loss of her husband in the U-2 incident became a personal reminder of the cost of brinkmanship. She raised their children with stories of his bravery, ensuring they understood his role in averting a greater disaster. On the other side of the world, Soviet officer Yuri Volkov, who had manned a missile command post in Cuba, returned to a hero's welcome in Moscow. Yet Yuri struggled with what he had almost been ordered to do. If an American invasion had come, he was prepared to launch tactical nuclear missiles, a decision that would have plunged the world into unimaginable devastation. Yuri kept this burden to himself, finding solace only in quiet walks along the Moskva River. In the Florida Keys, locals who had watched the military buildup of Ortsac saw the quiet withdrawal of forces as both a relief and an unsettling reminder of how close they had come to being on the front lines. Stories of soldiers training for beach landings mingled with tales of fishing trips interrupted by the thrum of military aircraft overhead. Years after the crisis, scholars and journalists began piecing together the full story. Declassified documents revealed just how close the world had come to nuclear war. Operation Ortsac, once a tightly held secret, was now discussed in lectures and books as an example of Cold War brinkmanship. At a university lecture in 1982, historian Angela Myers recounted the details of Ortsac to an enraptured audience. She described the planned amphibious landings, the aerial strategies, and the diplomatic tightrope walked by Kennedy and Khrushchev. "What we must remember," she said, "is not just how the crisis ended, but how it began through misunderstanding, mistrust, and the dangerous belief in the inevitability of war." For those who had lived through it, the crisis became a tale to tell their children and grandchildren. On a quiet evening in Havana, Carlos Mejia sat with his granddaughter, Anna, pointing to the skies. "There were planes up there, watching us, marking us as targets. But we stood firm. Remember this, Anna, courage is not the absence of fear but standing tall despite it." As the Cold War continued its twists and turns, the memory of the Cuban Missile Crisis faded into the background for many, yet its lessons persisted. The world had survived the brink barely. Operation Pluto, a covert CIA plan aimed at destabilizing Fidel Castro's regime in Cuba through sabotage, propaganda, and subversion during the Cold War. In the early 1960s, the world was split by an invisible curtain of ideology. On one side, nations rallied under the banner of capitalism and democracy, led by the United States. On the other, the shadow of communism spread steadily, championed by the Soviet Union. Nowhere was this divide more palpable than in the Caribbean, where a small island nation stood as the unexpected flashpoint of global tensions. This was Cuba, and it was here that history would take a fateful turn. The year was 1959. Fidel Castro, a charismatic revolutionary, had overthrown the corrupt dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista. Castro's rise was met with hope by some and suspicion by others. As he implemented sweeping reforms, including the nationalization of industries and redistribution of land, his vision for Cuba became clear. The island was charting a new course, one that aligned closely with the Soviet Union. For the United States, just 90 miles to the north, this was an unacceptable threat. In Washington, political and military leaders grew restless. The newly inaugurated President John F. Kennedy inherited a brewing storm. A covert plan to overthrow Castro had been set in motion during the Eisenhower administration, but now it was Kennedy's responsibility to decide its fate. Underneath the polished veneer of diplomatic discussions, the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, was hard at work, training Cuban exiles for a mission that would soon be known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. Meanwhile, in the heart of Cuba, whispers of dissent and rebellion reached Castro's ears. The revolutionary leader was no stranger to plots against him. His intelligence network, efficient and ruthless, began piecing together fragments of a looming danger. But for now, his focus remained on solidifying alliances and arming his nation against what he believed was an inevitable invasion. As 1961 dawned, the world held its breath. The clash of ideologies had reached Cuba's shores, and the fate of the island would soon hang in the balance. The stage was set for a conflict that would ripple far beyond the Caribbean waters, altering the course of the Cold War itself. In the dimly lit halls of Langley, Virginia, the CIA's headquarters buzzed with activity. Months of planning were converging into a single, decisive operation. The plan, codenamed Operation Zapata, aimed to topple Fidel Castro's regime by leveraging Cuban exiles who longed to reclaim their homeland. These men, many of them former military officers and professionals, had been driven from Cuba by Castro's revolution. Now, they trained in secret, preparing for the mission that promised to restore their country. The operation relied on deception and precision. Small teams of exiles would launch an amphibious assault on Cuba's southern coast, at a secluded inlet known as the Bay of Pigs. The plan hinged on secrecy, but cracks began to form. Reports of covert training camps leaked, and Cuban intelligence operatives closely monitored these developments. Meanwhile, Castro's government tightened its grip, arresting suspected dissidents and strengthening defenses. In Washington, President Kennedy faced a pivotal decision. The CIA assured him that the operation could succeed, but doubts lingered. Kennedy, mindful of the young presidency he needed to protect, approved the plan with a critical adjustment. Overt U.S. military support was off the table. It was a gamble that would define his administration and reshape the balance of the Cold War. As the invasion drew closer, tensions mounted among the exiles. They were united in their hatred for Castro but divided in their expectations. Some saw themselves as liberators, destined to spark a nationwide uprising, while others feared the odds stacked against them. For now, they clung to hope and the promise of victory, their resolve hardening with every passing day. In Havana, the mood was tense but defiant. Fidel Castro, aware of the rising storm, addressed his nation with fiery speeches. He called for unity against imperialist aggression and painted the United States as a looming enemy. Crowds of supporters filled the streets, chanting slogans of revolution and waving banners emblazoned with Castro's likeness. Yet beneath the fervor, unease simmered. Not all Cubans embraced Castro's vision. Landowners who had lost their estates, businessmen whose assets had been seized, and families torn apart by political purges harbored deep resentment. These divisions provided fertile ground for dissent, but open opposition was dangerous. The government's watchful eye reached every corner of society, silencing voices of dissent with arrests and imprisonment. Amid this backdrop, the seeds of resistance quietly took root. A young man named Enrique, once a student leader, had become disillusioned with the revolution. His family had fled to Miami, leaving him behind to navigate the increasingly oppressive landscape. Enrique's world intersected with others like him. Maria, a schoolteacher questioning the propaganda she taught, and Rafael, a dock worker with a secret stash of anti-Castro pamphlets. Together, they formed a loose network, dreaming of a Cuba free from tyranny, yet uncertain of how to achieve it. As whispers of an invasion spread, Enrique and his circle debated their next steps. Should they wait for liberation or risk everything by taking action? The uncertainty weighed heavily, but one thing was clear: change was coming, and they would play a part in the unfolding drama. In the coastal villages of southern Cuba, life moved at a steady rhythm. Fishermen hauled in their daily catch, children played along the sandy shores, and farmers worked tirelessly under the tropical sun. Yet even here, whispers of a brewing conflict reached attentive ears. The rumors were vague: foreign forces, exiles, plots, but the tension was undeniable. The revolution's enemies were closer than ever. Manuel, a fisherman in Playa Huron, often listened to his neighbors' hushed conversations. His brother, a staunch supporter of Castro, had warned him about aiding any counter-revolutionary efforts. But Manuel was torn. His village had been swept up in the promises of land reform and equality, yet the reality had been different. Friends had vanished overnight, and fear had crept into every aspect of life. One evening, as Manuel mended his fishing nets, he spotted unfamiliar movements along the shoreline. Men in military uniforms patrolled the beaches, rifles slung across their shoulders. The government was preparing for something, and the unease in the village deepened. Manuel's thoughts turned to his family, his wife, Rosa, and their young son. What would happen to them if war came to their doorstep? Far from the coastline, in Havana, Castro's forces worked tirelessly to reinforce their defenses. Intelligence reports hinted at an impending invasion, though the exact location and timing remained uncertain. The Cuban leader intensified his rhetoric, rallying the nation to defend the revolution at all costs. The tension in the air was almost tangible, as if the island itself was bracing for the storm to come. In Washington, the countdown to the invasion began in earnest. The CIA operated in a world of shadows, where misinformation was a weapon, and trust was a rare commodity. Radio transmissions, intercepted communiques, and clandestine meetings painted a fragmented picture of Cuba's readiness. Analysts debated whether Castro's forces would crumble under pressure or rally with the fervor of revolutionaries defending their homeland. President Kennedy, facing mounting pressure, met with his advisors in the Oval Office. The young president's idealism clashed with the grim realities of Cold War geopolitics. He was determined to project strength without triggering a broader conflict. Yet doubts gnawed at him. Could a covert operation succeed without the overt backing of the U.S. military? The stakes were immense, and failure could have devastating consequences. Meanwhile, on the island, Cuban intelligence was piecing together fragments of the plot. Defectors and informants provided hints of the exiles' plans, but the details were elusive. Castro's inner circle debated their response. Should they fortify the beaches, or would the enemy strike elsewhere? The lack of clarity only heightened the paranoia that gripped Havana's leadership. As the final plans were laid, Enrique and a small circle of dissidents in Havana prepared for what they believed was an imminent turning point. They had no contact with the exile forces but shared the same hope, the collapse of Castro's regime. They printed flyers, spreading messages of resistance under the cover of darkness, risking their lives with every act of defiance. On the evening of April 14, 1961, under a moonlit sky, the fleet carrying Brigade 2506 set sail for Cuba. The ships, laden with eager fighters and their equipment, cut through the dark waters toward the Bay of Pigs. Eduardo stood on the deck of one vessel, gazing toward the horizon. This was the moment they had been waiting for, and yet, a quiet unease lingered in his mind. As dawn broke, the first phase of the operation commenced. A series of airstrikes targeted Cuban airfields, aiming to cripple Castro's air force. The planes, painted to resemble Cuban aircraft, roared over the island, dropping their payloads. The CIA had hoped the strikes would go unnoticed by the world, but the international spotlight quickly turned to Cuba. The Cuban government condemned the attacks, accusing the United States of blatant aggression. In Havana, Fidel Castro stood resolute. He ordered his forces to prepare for a ground invasion, suspecting the airstrikes were just the beginning. Along the southern coast, the Cuban militia mobilized, digging trenches and setting up defensive positions. Villagers like Manuel watched in silent apprehension as their quiet community transformed into a battleground. The exiles' fleet continued its approach, the men aboard brimming with anticipation and anxiety. They knew the risks but believed in their mission. For them, this was not just an invasion. It was a chance to reclaim their homeland and rewrite the story of Cuba. As the sun set on April 16th, they neared the shoreline, ready to make their stand. In the pre-dawn hours of April 17, 1961, the waters off the Bay of Pigs shimmered under a thin veil of mist. The landing crafts moved silently toward the shore, their engines humming softly. The men of Brigade 2506, clad in khaki uniforms, gripped their rifles tightly, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. Eduardo stood near the front of one craft, his eyes fixed on the dim outline of the coastline ahead. The first wave of exiles hit the beaches of Playa Huron and Playa Larga. The soft sand, once a serene escape for fishermen and villagers, now bore the weight of boots, weapons, and crates of supplies. At first, the landing seemed smooth. The invaders quickly set up defensive positions and radioed back to their command ships. But the calm was deceptive. In nearby villages, the sound of distant motors had stirred the Cuban militia. Scouts alerted their superiors, and within hours, Castro's forces began to converge on the area. The Cuban defenders were a mix of regular soldiers, police, and volunteers, many of whom were poorly trained but fiercely loyal to the revolution. They moved quickly, setting up roadblocks and preparing counterattacks. Manuel watched from a distance, torn between fear and a strange sense of inevitability. The invaders were not strangers. They spoke his language, carried Cuban flags, and shared his heritage. Yet they were here as enemies, their arrival shattering the fragile peace of his home. As gunfire echoed across the bay, he clutched his young son close, uncertain of what the morning would bring. By mid-morning, The battle for the beaches was in full swing. Cuban planes, those that had survived the earlier airstrikes, took to the skies, strafing the invaders and sinking several of their supply ships. Without air cover, Brigade 2506 found themselves vulnerable, their position growing more precarious by the hour. Eduardo coordinated with his fellow officers, directing fire and rallying the men. Despite their training, the exiles were ill-prepared for the ferocity of the Cuban counterattack. Waves of militia charged their positions, and the narrow beaches offered little room for retreat. The once organized landing devolved into chaos as ammunition ran low and communication lines were disrupted. On the other side, Castro's forces pushed forward relentlessly. Maria, the schoolteacher turned militia volunteer, found herself thrust into the heart of the conflict. She carried messages between units, her courage growing with each passing hour. In her mind, the invaders were traitors, their presence an affront to the revolution she had reluctantly come to accept. As the day wore on, both sides suffered heavy losses. The beaches, once pristine, were now scarred with craters and littered with debris. For the exiles, the hope of sparking a broader uprising seemed to fade with every volley of gunfire. Yet they held their ground, driven by a determination that refused to waver. In Havana, news of the invasion spread rapidly. Castro addressed the nation in an impassioned speech, rallying his people to defend the revolution. Radio broadcasts crackled with updates from the front, painting the exiles as pawns of American imperialism. The streets filled with demonstrations of support, but beneath the surface, fear and uncertainty lingered. Enrique and his circle of dissidents listened intently to the reports. For them, the invasion was a glimmer of hope, a chance to see Castro's regime topple. But as the hours passed, the reality of the situation became clear. The invaders were outnumbered and outgunned, their position increasingly desperate. Enrique wrestled with the decision to act. Should they seize the moment or wait, knowing that failure could mean death? In the Cuban high command, Fidel Castro's confidence grew. Reports from the front indicated that the exiles were faltering. He ordered reinforcements to the area, determined to crush the invasion decisively. Yet even as victory seemed within reach, he knew the battle was far from over. The United States loomed in the background, its response unpredictable. As night fell over Havana, the city buzzed with anticipation. Soldiers prepared for deployment, civilians braced for retaliation, and the dissidents plotted their next move. The fate of the invasion, and of Cuba, hung precariously in the balance, the outcome uncertain. As darkness descended over the Bay of Pigs, the fighting paused only briefly. Exhausted soldiers on both sides sought cover, their weapons close at hand. For the exiles, the night brought little respite. With supplies dwindling and reinforcements unlikely, their chances of survival grew slimmer by the hour. Eduardo gathered his men in a makeshift bunker. By candlelight, he outlined a plan to fortify their position and hold until morning. Around him, the faces of his comrades reflected a mix of determination and despair. They had come so far, but the reality of their isolation weighed heavily. The sounds of sporadic gunfire echoed through the night, a haunting reminder of the battle still raging. Meanwhile, Castro's forces pressed their advantage. Trucks laden with reinforcements rumbled toward the front, their headlights cutting through the darkened roads. Among them was Maria, now armed and resolute. The militia commander's orders were clear: drive the invaders into the sea. Maria clenched her rifle tightly, her nerves steeled by the knowledge that failure could mean the fall of the revolution. In the village of Playa Girón, Manuel and his family huddled in their small home. The once quiet village had transformed into a battlefield, and the fear of stray bullets or airstrikes kept them awake. He could hear the muffled cries of wounded soldiers and the distant roar of artillery. For Manuel, the war was no longer an abstract concept. It had become a living nightmare. Dawn broke over the bay, revealing a battlefield marked by destruction. The exiles were running out of options. Cut off from their supply lines and facing relentless attacks, their once strong resolve began to waver. Eduardo knew they needed help. Desperate, he used their remaining radio equipment to plead for reinforcements and air support. On the other side, Castro stood triumphant. His forces had encircled the invaders, cutting off any chance of retreat. Yet he remained cautious. The U.S. response was still a wild card, and he instructed his commanders to prepare for potential escalation. For Castro, the stakes extended beyond this battle. His revolution's survival depended on victory. In Miami, the families of the Brigade 2,506 fighters anxiously awaited news. Among them was Eduardo's wife, Anna, who listened to radio updates with a heavy heart. She clung to the hope that her husband would return, even as reports painted a grim picture of the invasion's progress. Back in Havana, Enrique and his dissident network debated their next move. The invasion's failure seemed imminent, yet they knew the regime would tighten its grip in the aftermath. Risking exposure, they decided to lay low, waiting for another opportunity to act. For now, survival was their priority. With the invaders pinned down, Castro launched a decisive counterattack. Cuban tanks rolled into position, their cannons roaring as they pounded the exiles' defenses. The ground shook with each explosion, and the air filled with the acrid scent of gunpowder. Castro's soldiers, emboldened by their leader's rhetoric, surged forward with unrelenting force. On the beaches, the exiles fought valiantly, their determination unshaken despite the odds. Eduardo took command of a machine gun nest, his calm leadership inspiring those around him. But as the hours wore on, the weight of the Cuban assault became unbearable. Men fell one by one, their dreams of liberation slipping away with each loss. In the chaos, Maria found herself face to face with an injured exile. He raised his hands in surrender, his uniform torn and bloody. For a moment, their eyes met. Maria hesitated, the humanity of the moment clashing with the propaganda she had been fed. She lowered her rifle, signaling for medics to take him away. By evening, the battle's outcome was clear. The exiles were overwhelmed, their lines broken, and their morale shattered. As the last pockets of resistance fell silent, Castro's forces celebrated a hard-fought victory. The invasion was over, but its consequences were only beginning to unfold. The Bay of Pigs invasion ended in a catastrophic defeat for Brigade 2,506. Hundreds of exiles were captured, and scores were killed. The beaches, now littered with debris and bodies, bore the scars of a short but intense conflict. Castro, triumphant, used the victory to bolster his position both domestically and internationally. Eduardo was among those captured. Shackled and marched through the streets, he faced jeers from crowds celebrating the revolution's survival. Yet even in defeat, he held his head high, his mind already focused on the next chapter of his fight. For him and his comrades, captivity was not the end, it was a new beginning. In Havana, Enrique listened to the triumphant speeches on the radio with a heavy heart. The failure of the invasion meant the dissident movement would face harsher crackdowns. He knew he would need to stay hidden, his dreams of freedom postponed yet again. Meanwhile, in Washington, President Kennedy bore the brunt of the political fallout. The botched operation strained his administration's credibility and deepened Cold War tensions. For the CIA, the failure was a humbling lesson, forcing a re-evaluation of its covert strategies. The Bay of Pigs invasion had failed, but its echoes would resonate for years to come, shaping the lives of all those it touched and altering the trajectory of the Cold War itself. In the days following the invasion, the captured exiles were transported to Havana under heavy guard. Shackled and disheveled, they were paraded before crowds who jeered and cursed at them. Eduardo and his comrades were herded into a sprawling prison compound, where they awaited their fate. Their dreams of liberation had crumbled, replaced by the cold reality of captivity. Inside the prison walls, life was harsh but not devoid of hope. Eduardo quickly became a source of quiet strength among the detainees. He urged his fellow prisoners to remain resilient, reminding them that their struggle was not in vain. They shared stories of home, their voices filled with longing and determination, a small act of defiance against despair. Outside, Castro leveraged the captives as propaganda tools. He painted them as mercenaries, puppets of U.S. imperialism. State-run newspapers published photographs of the prisoners, emphasizing their foreign-supplied weapons and equipment. For Castro, the victory was more than military. It was a chance to rally his people and strengthen his grip on power. Far away in Miami, the families of the captured exiles mourned their loss but refused to abandon hope. Ana, Eduardo's wife, joined a group of relatives who lobbied tirelessly for their release. They wrote letters to politicians, organized rallies, and appealed to the international community. Their fight had shifted from liberation to ensuring their loved ones' survival. In Havana, the aftermath of the invasion brought a wave of repression. Castro's government tightened its grip, rounding up suspected dissidents and imposing stricter controls on the population. For Enrique and his network, the risks of resistance had multiplied. Informants lurked everywhere, and any hint of dissent could lead to imprisonment, or worse. Maria, once a reluctant supporter of the revolution, now found herself embroiled in its machinery. After her role in the militia's victory, she was promoted to a position of authority. But the realities of her new role weighed heavily on her conscience. She witnessed the brutal interrogations of prisoners and the suppression of free speech. The idealism that had once driven her support for Castro began to erode. Despite the dangers, Enrique and his group refused to give up. They distributed underground newsletters and gathered intelligence on government movements. Each act of defiance carried immense risk, but it also fueled their determination. They knew the road to freedom would be long and fraught with peril, but they were unwilling to abandon their cause. In the countryside, villages like Playa Huron remained under heavy surveillance. Manuel, the fisherman, watched as his home was transformed into a symbol of revolutionary triumph. Military checkpoints and propaganda posters became part of daily life. For Manuel, the revolution no longer felt like a promise. It was an oppressive force that had robbed him of his peace. Back in Washington, the Kennedy administration scrambled to address the fallout from the invasion. The president faced harsh criticism from allies and adversaries alike. Determined to salvage some measure of success, Kennedy initiated secret talks to negotiate the release of the captured exiles. The negotiations were delicate and fraught with tension. Castro demanded reparations in exchange for the prisoners, seeking not only financial compensation but also recognition of his regime's legitimacy. For Kennedy, the stakes were high. A misstep could further damage his administration's credibility and embolden Castro on the global stage. In Havana, the prisoners clung to the hope of freedom. Eduardo kept his fellow detainees focused on survival, organizing small acts of resistance within the prison. They smuggled messages to their families, sending coded notes that carried both reassurance and pleas for help. As months turned into a year, progress was slow but steady. Behind closed doors, intermediaries worked to broker a deal. The exiles' families in Miami staged demonstrations, their voices growing louder with each passing day. For them, every delay was a reminder of their loved ones' suffering, but also a call to persist in their fight. By late 1962, after months of back-channel diplomacy, a breakthrough emerged. The United States agreed to provide food and medical supplies worth millions of dollars in exchange for the prisoners' release. The deal, though controversial, marked a rare moment of agreement in the volatile relationship between Havana and Washington. The announcement brought a wave of relief to the prisoners and their families. In the prison compound, Eduardo and his comrades prepared for their return, their spirits buoyed by the promise of freedom. But they also carried the weight of their failure, knowing their liberation came at a steep cost. On Christmas Eve, the first group of prisoners boarded planes bound for Miami. The scenes at the airport were emotional as families reunited after more than a year of separation. Ana embraced Eduardo tightly, her tears of joy mingling with the pain of the past year. For the exiles, their journey was far from over. They had survived captivity, but the dream of a free Cuba remained unfulfilled. In Havana, Castro framed the exchange as another victory. He used the deal to bolster his image as a shrewd leader who had bested a superpower. Yet the scars of the invasion lingered, both for Cuba and for the exiles who had dared to challenge its revolution. The release of the Brigade 2,506 prisoners was met with celebration in Miami, but the mood was bittersweet. For the exiles, the wounds of their defeat at the Bay of Pigs still ran deep. Eduardo, now reunited with his family, struggled to reconcile his freedom with the weight of failure. He often spent long hours in quiet reflection, the images of battle and captivity playing endlessly in his mind. Miami, now a hub for the Cuban exile community, buzzed with activity. Refugees shared stories of loss and survival, their voices mingling in cafes and meeting halls. Amid the camaraderie, the desire to reclaim their homeland remained strong. Plans for another uprising circulated in hushed conversations, but the shadow of the Bay of Pigs hung heavy over these ambitions. In Cuba, the aftermath of the invasion continued to shape daily life. Castro's government grew more authoritarian, using the failed invasion as justification for increased surveillance and crackdowns. Maria, once a devoted revolutionary, now felt trapped in the regime she had helped defend. She avoided questioning her superiors openly but found solace in small acts of rebellion, like passing supplies to families of imprisoned dissidents. For Enrique and his network, the invasion's failure had not crushed their spirit. If anything, it strengthened their resolve. They worked tirelessly to document human rights abuses and smuggle information out of Cuba. Though their efforts were fraught with danger, they believed their actions would one day play a role in ending Castro's reign. The Bay of Pigs invasion had far-reaching consequences beyond Cuba's shores. In Moscow, the Soviet Union viewed the event as a testament to U.S. aggression, solidifying its alliance with Castro. Military aid flowed into Cuba, including weapons and advisors, further entrenching the island in the communist bloc. Washington, reeling from the failure, reassessed its strategy toward Cuba. The Kennedy administration imposed a full trade embargo, isolating the island economically. Covert operations aimed at undermining Castro's government continued, though the CIA's credibility had taken a significant blow. The tension between the superpowers escalated, with Cuba at the heart of the conflict. By late 1962, the situation reached a critical point as the Cuban Missile Crisis unfolded. For many of the exiles, the crisis rekindled hopes of U.S. intervention, but those hopes were quickly dashed when a diplomatic resolution diffused the standoff without toppling Castro. For Manuel, life in Playa Girón returned to a semblance of normalcy, though the scars of the invasion lingered. His village remained a symbol of revolutionary resilience, often visited by officials and foreign dignitaries. Yet for Manuel, the revolution's promises felt hollow. The quiet suffering of his neighbors spoke louder than the triumphant slogans painted on the walls. Back in Miami, Eduardo emerged as a quiet leader among the exile community. He attended meetings, spoke at rallies, and counseled younger refugees who sought guidance. Though he remained haunted by the past, he channeled his energy into rebuilding his life and contributing to the struggle for a free Cuba. One evening, Anna found Eduardo poring over maps and reports from dissident networks in Cuba. He spoke of returning to the island, not as a soldier but as a liaison to support the underground resistance. Anna's heart sank at the thought, but she understood his determination. "If I don't do this," he said softly, "who will?" As Eduardo prepared for his journey, he reconnected with former Brigade 2,506 members. Together, they formed a clandestine network to support dissidents in Cuba. Their efforts ranged from smuggling supplies to disseminating information, each act a small step toward their shared goal. Eduardo's decision marked a turning point, both for him and the exile community. It was a testament to their resilience and a reminder that the fight for freedom was far from over. Though the road ahead was uncertain, Eduardo carried with him the hope that one day, his homeland would be free. In Havana, Enrique's network had grown steadily despite the government's efforts to dismantle. By the mid-1960s, their activities had expanded to include sabotage, propaganda, and coordinating with exile groups. Each success fueled their belief that Castro's regime was not invincible. Maria, still grappling with her disillusionment, began to drift closer to Enrique's circle. She provided valuable information about government operations, her position within the regime shielding her from suspicion. For Maria, this was more than an act of rebellion. It was a way to atone for her role in defending a system she no longer believed in. Meanwhile, in the countryside, resistance movements gained traction among disenfranchised farmers and laborers. Manuel, emboldened by the quiet defiance of his neighbors, began aiding the resistance by providing shelter and information. Though his actions were small, they carried immense risk, and each night he prayed for the safety of his family. As the resistance grew, so did the regime's response. Raids, arrests, and public executions became common, yet the seeds of dissent had taken root. For every voice silenced, another rose to take its place. The struggle for Cuba's future was far from over, and its outcome remained uncertain. Operation Mongoose. In the early 1960s, the world stood at the precipice of war, its tensions palpable as Cold War adversaries plotted their moves in a deadly game of geopolitical chess. Against this backdrop, Operation Mongoose was born, a covert initiative spearheaded by the United States government to destabilize Fidel Castro's regime in Cuba. Officially approved by President John F. Kennedy in November 1961, the operation marked a dark chapter in the annals of international relations, blending espionage, sabotage, and psychological warfare. This story chronicles the intricate web of events, the lives affected, and the covert operations that defined one of history's most audacious attempts at regime change. Through a tapestry of perspectives, from high-ranking U.S. officials to Cuban civilians caught in the crossfire, it paints a vivid picture of the desperation and determination that characterized this perilous period. In the shadowy corridors of Washington, D.C., whispers of concern echoed as Fidel Castro ascended to power in 1959. The Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, watched warily, suspecting that his revolution harbored communist sympathies. While initial evidence was sparse, Castro's alliance with figures like Ernesto Che Guevara and Raul Castro deepened fears within the U.S. intelligence community. By the end of 1960, these suspicions had crystallized into action. High-ranking officials, including General C.P. Cabell, debated strategies to counteract Cuba's perceived threat. The failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961 only intensified their resolve, highlighting the necessity for a more covert and calculated approach. Out of these discussions emerged Operation Mongoose, a multifaceted plan aimed at toppling Castro's government through sabotage, economic warfare, and psychological tactics. The operation's mastermind, Brigadier General Edward Lansdale, brought his counterinsurgency expertise to the table. Supported by CIA operatives and backed by Attorney General Robert Kennedy, Lansdale envisioned a campaign that would exploit internal dissent within Cuba. But as plans crystallized, it became evident that the task at hand was fraught with peril and uncertainty. In Cuba, the atmosphere was charged. Citizens grappling with economic hardships faced mounting propaganda from both sides. Castro, aware of the looming threat, fortified his regime, intensifying security and rallying his people against what he termed Yankee imperialism. It was a game of cat and mouse, with the stakes rising by the day. In the austere offices of Langley, Brigadier General Edward Lansdale unfurled a detailed map of Cuba, the island's topography etched in sharp relief. His voice, steady yet laced with urgency, outlined the strategy that would underpin Operation Mongoose. This is not a mere military campaign, Lansdale explained. It's psychological warfare, economic disruption, and sabotage, all aimed at dismantling Castro's grip from within. The operation sought to cripple Cuba's economy by targeting its sugar exports, the lifeblood of its economy. Saboteurs, trained by CIA operatives, would infiltrate sugar mills, ports, and storage facilities, ensuring that vital exports never left the island. At the same time, propaganda campaigns aimed to sow seeds of dissent among Cuban citizens, leveraging radio broadcasts and pamphlets to erode faith in Castro's leadership. Lansdale's audacity was matched only by his reliance on secrecy. To execute these plans, a special task force composed of CIA agents, military personnel, and Cuban exiles was assembled. Their mission was dangerous, the risks monumental. Failure was not an option. The stakes were too high, the consequences too dire. As the team began training in clandestine locations across Florida and Central America, the first whispers of resistance were already being heard in Havana. Castro's intelligence network, though nascent, was adept at intercepting covert activities. The seeds of a deadly cat-and-mouse game had been planted. While the United States plotted in secret, life in Cuba was marked by a simmering undercurrent of tension. Farmers worked fields that yielded less each year, while factory workers heard rumors of foreign plots to destroy their livelihood. In the bustling streets of Havana, whispers of spies and saboteurs were traded like currency in shadowy corners of cafes. Marta Lopez, a teacher in a small village near Santiago de Cuba, found her classroom increasingly dominated by propaganda sessions. Pictures of Fidel Castro adorned the walls, alongside slogans proclaiming defiance against Yankee aggression. Though loyal to the revolution, Marta noticed the unease growing among her neighbors. Supplies were dwindling, and the promise of a socialist utopia seemed further out of reach each day. Meanwhile, in the government's inner sanctums, Castro met with his advisors to address the growing threat. His speeches, fiery and resolute, galvanized supporters. Yet, even among his trusted circle, there were murmurs of doubt. The Cuban leader's relentless drive for consolidation often came at the expense of pragmatism, alienating potential allies within the island. As Operation Mongoose intensified, its impact began to ripple through Cuban society. The economy, already fragile, teetered on the edge as sabotage missions claimed critical infrastructure. For many like Marta, these disruptions were less about ideology and more about survival, a daily battle against unseen forces. By late 1961, the first wave of sabotage missions was underway. A team of operatives, disguised as fishermen, infiltrated Cuban waters to plant explosives at a key port facility. The explosion crippled a shipment of sugar bound for the Soviet Union, signaling the operational debut of Operation Mongoose. However, not all missions met with success. In one instance, a CIA agent, posing as a businessman, attempted to infiltrate a Havana-based union to incite rebellion. The mission failed spectacularly when local authorities uncovered the plot, leading to the agent's capture. The incident became a propaganda victory for Castro, who used it to rally his people against external threats. Amid these early efforts, tensions between the CIA and the Kennedy administration began to surface. Robert Kennedy, deeply invested in the operation's success, pressed for results. But the challenges of covert warfare, unpredictable agents, operational leaks, and logistical setbacks proved harder to overcome than anticipated. For the operatives on the ground, each mission carried the weight of immense pressure. Mistakes were not merely costly, they were deadly. Yet, with every success and failure, the operation gained momentum, its reach expanding even as its risks escalated. As 1962 dawned, the Cuban government intensified its efforts to uncover and neutralize threats. Raúl Castro, Fidel's brother and confidant, spearheaded the expansion of Cuba's counterintelligence operations. Military checkpoints multiplied, and loyalty oaths became routine. For ordinary citizens, the atmosphere of suspicion was suffocating. Conversations once shared freely in homes were now whispered, and neighbors eyed each other warily. Among those caught in the tightening net was Pedro Hernandez, a dock worker at the port of Havana. One evening, after a long shift unloading Soviet-supplied machinery, Pedro was approached by a stranger offering money for information about port security. Torn between financial desperation and fear of reprisal, Pedro reported the encounter to the local militia. The stranger disappeared, but the event left Pedro questioning who among his colleagues might be cooperating with the Americans. Meanwhile, in Florida, the CIA redoubled its training efforts. Camps teamed with Cuban exiles honing their skills in explosives, espionage, and sabotage. Many were fueled by personal vendettas against the Castro regime, their anger carefully stoked by U.S. handlers. These operatives, however, would soon learn that returning to their homeland as agents of subversion came with a heavy psychological toll. By March, a series of small-scale missions had succeeded in sabotaging sugar production and electrical infrastructure. Each act left an indelible mark on the Cuban populace, amplifying their resolve to resist foreign interference. Yet, for Fidel Castro, these attacks were proof of his government's narrative. The United States would stop at nothing to undermine the revolution. Operation Mongoose was becoming an increasingly complex endeavor, with layers of coordination between government agencies. The special group Augmented, a high-level committee formed to oversee the operation, met regularly in Washington. Chaired by Attorney General Robert Kennedy, these meetings were marked by heated debates over strategy and ethics. At the heart of the operation, Edward Lansdale's vision faced resistance from some quarters of the U.S. government. Skeptics questioned the morality and feasibility of the plan, while others feared its repercussions if exposed. Despite these concerns, the operation expanded its reach, employing innovative and sometimes bizarre tactics, such as plans to contaminate Cuban crops or poison Castro's cigars. On the ground, operatives like Carlos Gutierrez navigated a perilous existence. Carlos, a former Cuban soldier who defected to the United States, had been recruited as a field agent. Sent to infiltrate a rural militia, he lived under constant threat of exposure. Every glance, every question, was a potential trap, and the strain of his double life began to erode his mental fortitude. As Carlos and others like him played their roles in the unfolding drama, the web of covert operations grew more tangled. In Cuba, whispers of infiltrators spread like wildfire, further straining the fragile bonds of trust within communities. In the United States, the operation's architects grappled with a troubling reality. The more they escalated their efforts, the closer they came to provoking an international crisis. The covert war reached a critical juncture in October 1962, as the world watched the Cuban Missile Crisis unfold. Operation Mongoose, already fraught with risks, now operated under the shadow of nuclear annihilation. For the Kennedy administration, the stakes had never been higher. Any misstep in Cuba could spark a global conflict. Despite the mounting tension, the Special Group Augmented authorized several missions during the crisis. One such operation aimed to sabotage a Soviet cargo ship docked in Santiago de Cuba. The plan, though meticulously crafted, was scrapped at the last moment when U.S. intelligence revealed the presence of nuclear warheads aboard the ship. For the Cuban people, the missile crisis exacerbated the hardships of daily life. Marta Lopez, the village teacher, found herself explaining air raid drills to frightened children, their questions a stark reminder of the fragility of their existence. Meanwhile, soldiers like Raul Gomez, stationed in Havana, braced for an invasion they feared might come at any moment. When the crisis finally de-escalated, the relief was palpable but short-lived. Fidel Castro emerged emboldened, declaring victory against imperialist aggression. In Washington, the crisis prompted a reassessment of Operation Mongoose, with some officials arguing for its termination and others advocating its intensification. With the Cuban Missile Crisis in the rearview mirror, Operation Mongoose resumed its course, albeit with heightened caution. The fallout from the crisis had left the Kennedy administration divided on the operation's future. Some believed the covert campaign had become too risky, while others viewed it as a necessary measure to keep pressure on Castro's regime. In Cuba, life returned to a strained semblance of normalcy. Fidel Castro, emboldened by his perceived victory, intensified his rhetoric and policies against Yankee imperialism. State security forces cracked down harder on suspected dissidents, leading to a surge in arrests. For people like Pedro Hernandez, the dock worker, this meant living in a state of perpetual fear. Each day brought new rumors of spies and informants, creating an atmosphere of distrust even among neighbors. Meanwhile, in Florida, CIA operatives evaluated their recent missions. The debriefings painted a stark picture. While some sabotage efforts had succeeded, many operatives were compromised or captured. For Carlos Gutierrez, the exiled Cuban agent, the psychological toll of his missions was becoming unbearable. Haunted by the faces of those he had betrayed, Carlos began to question the price of his allegiance to the United States. The special group augmented faced mounting pressure to justify the operation. As they debated new strategies, it became clear that the campaign's ultimate success depended on a delicate balance of subtlety and aggression. But in the volatile landscape of Cold War politics, such balance was proving elusive. By mid-1963, Operation Mongoose had evolved into a labyrinthine network of missions targeting Cuba's economic and military infrastructure. Sabotage teams struck at sugar mills, electrical grids, and oil refineries, leaving a trail of destruction. Each attack was meticulously planned, but execution was often fraught with unexpected challenges. One mission, led by a small group of Cuban exiles, aimed to disrupt a major oil depot near Matanzas. The operatives, disguised as fishermen, navigated treacherous waters to plant explosives. As dawn broke, the depot erupted in flames, a victory that came at a steep cost. 2 operatives were captured during their retreat. Under interrogation, they revealed key details of the operation, dealing a significant blow to the CIA's efforts. In Havana, the fallout from such attacks was felt deeply. Marta Lopez, the village teacher, watched as food shortages worsened, and daily power outages became the norm. Her students, once eager to learn, now struggled to stay awake in dimly lit classrooms. Yet, amid the hardships, Marta found solace in the resilience of her community. "We are stronger than they think," she wrote in her journal, a quiet defiance against the unseen enemy. Back in Washington, the special group augmented grappled with the consequences of their escalating campaign. Each act of sabotage brought them closer to their goal but also risked exposure. For Lansdale and his team, the line between victory and catastrophe grew ever thinner. As Operation Mongoose stretched into its second year, cracks began to appear in its foundation. Within the Cuban exile community, frustration simmered. Many operatives felt that their sacrifices were not yielding tangible results. Carlos Gutierrez, once a staunch supporter of the campaign, found himself questioning its purpose. "Are we liberators?" he confided to a fellow operative, "or pawns in a bigger game?" This disillusionment was mirrored among some members of the Kennedy administration. Robert Kennedy, once the operation's fiercest advocate, began to voice concerns about its direction. Reports of civilian casualties and the increasing risk of exposure weighed heavily on his conscience. "If we are not careful," he warned during a heated meeting, "we will become the very thing we seek to destroy." In Cuba, the government's counterintelligence efforts bore fruit. A series of high-profile arrests dismantled several CIA-backed cells, further stoking fears among the populace. Pedro Hernandez, the dock worker, narrowly escaped one such sweep, but his neighbor was not so lucky. The incident deepened Pedro's resolve to steer clear of any entanglements, even as whispers of resistance continued to circulate. The operation's unraveling loyalties and mounting setbacks painted a grim picture. Yet, for its architects, abandoning the campaign was unthinkable. The stakes were too high, and the cost of failure too great. Operation Mongoose pressed on, its shadow stretching ever longer over Cuba and the United States. By late 1963, Operation Mongoose's operatives had refined their methods, blending sabotage with psychological tactics to destabilize Cuba. The operation's reach extended into urban centers and rural villages, where its presence was felt in the form of sporadic attacks and disruptive propaganda. One notable mission targeted Havana's radio broadcast towers. A group of exiles, posing as maintenance workers, infiltrated the facility under the cover of night. Their goal was to interrupt Castro's weekly address with a pre-recorded message from the United States. The plan was audacious, but as dawn approached, the team was discovered. A tense shootout ensued, leaving one operative dead and another captured. The failure of the mission underscored the perils of direct action in a heavily monitored environment. For Marta Lopez, the teacher in Santiago de Cuba, the psychological toll of living under constant threat was becoming unbearable. Her school, once a haven for children, now resembled a fortress, with armed guards patrolling the perimeter. Yet Marta refused to let fear dictate her life. She began teaching her students lessons in resilience, emphasizing the importance of unity in the face of adversity. Meanwhile, in Washington, Edward Lansdale faced mounting criticism. The operation's growing list of failures cast a shadow over his leadership. Despite this, Lansdale remained resolute. Every setback, he argued in a meeting with the special group, is an opportunity to learn and adapt. His optimism, however, was beginning to wear thin among his colleagues. As the years wore on, the human cost of Operation Mongoose became increasingly apparent. For the Cuban people, the sabotage campaigns left scars both physical and emotional. Factories lay in ruins, families were torn apart, and a pervasive sense of mistrust lingered in every corner of society. Pedro Hernandez, the dock worker, bore witness to these hardships daily. The port where he worked was a frequent target of attacks, leaving him and his colleagues to clean up the aftermath of explosions and fires. Despite his fear, Pedro found small acts of defiance within himself, repairing machinery, sharing rations, and comforting his neighbors. "We survived," he told his wife one evening, "because we have no choice but to endure." In Miami, Cuban exiles grappled with their own struggles. Many had left behind families and livelihoods, only to find themselves embroiled in a campaign that offered little reward. For Carlos Gutierrez, the toll was personal. Haunted by memories of betrayal and loss, he began to withdraw from his fellow operatives. His once unshakable resolve was now clouded by doubt and regret. Despite these challenges, the CIA pressed forward. Each mission was meticulously planned, though success remained elusive. For the architects of Operation Mongoose, the question was no longer whether they could topple Castro's regime but whether they could justify the sacrifices being made in pursuit of that goal. In Washington, the political landscape surrounding Operation Mongoose shifted as new leaders took office. Following John F. Kennedy's assassination in November 1963, Lyndon B. Johnson inherited the presidency and, with it, the complexities of the covert campaign in Cuba. Johnson's administration, focused on domestic priorities and the escalating conflict in Vietnam, was less enthusiastic about continuing the operation. Despite this, the special group augmented pressed on. Meetings became more contentious, with members debating the ethics and efficacy of their actions. Robert Kennedy, still a staunch advocate for the campaign, clashed with colleagues who viewed Mongoose as a drain on resources and a diplomatic liability. "This is not just about Cuba," Kennedy argued. "It's about sending a message to the world about what we stand for." In Cuba, Castro capitalized on the U.S.'s political turmoil, solidifying his alliances with the Soviet Union and other communist nations. He portrayed Operation Mongoose as evidence of American imperialism, rallying his people to the cause of resistance. For Marta Lopez, these speeches were both inspiring and troubling. She admired Castro's resolve but feared the endless cycle of retaliation that defined their lives. As 1964 approached, the campaign's future hung in the balance. While its proponents sought to double down on their efforts, its detractors warned of diminishing returns. The stage was set for a reckoning that would determine the fate of one of the most ambitious covert operations in history. By early 1964, Operation Mongoose had reached a critical juncture. The operations architects faced mounting skepticism from within the Kennedy administration's remnants, now overseen by President Lyndon B. Johnson. The covert campaign, once a priority under Robert Kennedy's watchful eye, was increasingly seen as a distraction from broader Cold War strategies. Edward Lansdale, whose reputation had been tied to the operation's success, found himself on precarious ground. During a special group augmented meeting, Lansdale's proposals to escalate operations were met with tepid responses. "We're not in a position to gamble anymore," one senior official remarked. "Our focus needs to shift elsewhere." The remark stung, signaling a slow erosion of institutional support for the campaign. In Cuba, the effects of mongoose remained undeniable. Sabotage operations, though less frequent, continued to disrupt daily life. The destruction of an oil depot near Cienfuegos sent shockwaves through the local economy, leaving thousands without work. Pedro Hernandez, the dock worker, joined others in the grueling task of rebuilding, his hands calloused from days spent clearing debris. "It's our country," he told a journalist covertly documenting the aftermath. "We rebuild it, no matter how many times they try to tear it down." For Marta Lopez, teaching under flickering light bulbs became the norm. Her students, many of whom came from families directly affected by sabotage, grew quieter with each passing week. Their resilience was a source of pride but also a painful reminder of what had been lost. The geopolitical landscape continued to shift, forcing Operation Mongoose to adapt. The Soviet Union, emboldened by the Cuban Missile Crisis resolution, ramped up its support for Fidel Castro's government. Soviet engineers and technicians flooded Cuba, strengthening its infrastructure and military capabilities. For the United States, this presented both a challenge and a justification for maintaining the covert campaign. In Miami, tensions within the exiled community reached a boiling point. Many operatives felt abandoned, their sacrifices seemingly overlooked by the very government they served. Carlos Gutierrez, whose disillusionment had deepened, attended a clandestine meeting of disgruntled exiles. "We fought for freedom," he said, his voice heavy with anger. "But freedom is a hollow promise when it's met with silence." The CIA, under pressure to deliver results, shifted its focus to psychological operations. Leaflets, radio broadcasts, and staged defections became tools in their arsenal, aimed at sowing distrust among Castro's inner circle. However, these efforts often fell flat, their impact muted by Castro's well-organized propaganda machine. In Cuba, Marta's village experienced one of these psychological campaigns firsthand. Late one night, loudspeakers blared messages urging villagers to rise against the regime. The next morning, soldiers combed the area, arresting anyone suspected of involvement. For Marta, it was a chilling reminder of how deeply the conflict had permeated their lives. As 1964 drew to a close, Operation Mongoose faced its final days. The covert campaign, once heralded as a bold strategy to overthrow Fidel Castro, had devolved into a series of sporadic and largely ineffectual efforts. The special group augmented, now fractured, convened less frequently, its members divided over the operation's continuation. Edward Lansdale, ever the optimist, proposed one last push, a coordinated series of sabotage missions targeting key infrastructure. His plan was ambitious, involving multiple teams operating simultaneously across the island. But as preparations began, resistance from within the U.S. government grew. "We're risking too much for too little," one dissenting voice argued. The sentiment was shared by many, including Lyndon Johnson, who was reluctant to endorse further escalations amid growing tensions in Vietnam. In Cuba, whispers of the operation's waning momentum reached Pedro Hernandez and others like him. Though the attacks persisted, their frequency and impact had noticeably diminished. For Pedro, this was a small but significant victory. "We're still standing," he told his wife one evening. "That's what matters." Marta Lopez, too, felt the change. The sense of constant threat began to lift, replaced by cautious optimism. Yet, she knew the scars left by years of sabotage and fear would not fade easily. Her students, many of whom had grown up in the shadow of this conflict, carried those scars as deeply as the adults around them. In January 1965, Operation Mongoose was officially declared inactive. The decision, while not publicly announced, marked the end of one of the most audacious covert operations in U.S. history. For Edward Lansdale and his team, it was a bitter pill to swallow. "We set out to change history," Lansdale later reflected, "but history changed us instead." For the Cuban exile community, the operation's end was met with mixed emotions. Some saw it as an abandonment of their cause, while others viewed it as a necessary conclusion to a flawed campaign. Carlos Gutierrez, having withdrawn from active involvement months earlier, quietly returned to civilian life. His dreams of a free Cuba remained, but they were now tempered by the harsh realities of political gamesmanship. In Cuba, life slowly began to stabilize. Though the economic damage caused by the operation lingered, the Cuban people demonstrated remarkable resilience. For Marta Lopez, the end of Operation Mongoose meant a chance to rebuild her community. She threw herself into her work, determined to give her students a future unmarked by the shadows of the past. Pedro Hernandez, too, found solace in the cessation of hostilities. As he watched ships dock peacefully at the Havana port, he allowed himself a rare moment of hope. "Maybe," he mused, "we can finally move forward." Operation Peter Pan, a Cold War-era mission that airlifted over 14,000 Cuban children to the U.S., separating them from their families amid fears of communist indoctrination. The streets of Havana buzzed with life as they always had, children playing in cobblestone alleys, and people about their daily business. But beneath the vibrant surface, a quiet unease lingered. It was the dawn of the 1960s, and the Cuban Revolution had reshaped the island in ways both visible and unseen. Fidel Castro's government had recently nationalized industries, and a heavy shadow loomed over families who once thrived in the flourishing middle class. For many, the final blow came with whispers, quiet conversations over coffee about new government mandates. Schools would close. Private education would be replaced by a singular, state-run curriculum. It was said that children would be sent to youth camps or, worse, shipped to the Soviet Union for indoctrination. Parents like the Alvarez family clutched their young ones tightly at night, terrified of losing not only their freedoms but their future generations. Maria Alvarez, a school teacher in her early 30s, had always been hopeful, even as her husband, Miguel, grew more cynical by the day. Together, they had built a modest life in Cardenas, raising their 9-year-old son, Daniel. But now, Maria couldn't shake the gnawing dread. What if they come for him? She whispered one evening, the glow of a kerosene lamp flickering against the walls. Miguel's silence spoke volumes. Meanwhile, in Miami, Father Brian O. Walsh, a Catholic priest overseeing the local welfare bureau, was busy responding to a different kind of crisis. Cuban exiles poured into the city daily, carrying stories of fear and desperation. Parents begged for help, pleading for ways to save their children. "There's no time to wait," Walsh confided to his colleagues. "We need to act before it's too late." And so, the seeds of Operation Peter Pan were sown, not by governments, but by the collective will of frightened parents, resourceful priests, and a network of unsung heroes who refused to stand by. The wheels of history began to turn, though few could predict the extraordinary journey ahead. By mid-1960, the urgency among Cuban families had reached a fever pitch. The once distant fear of government control had begun creeping into reality. Private schools across the island were shuttered, and state-controlled institutions replaced them. These schools, adorned with revolutionary slogans and banners, bore the unmistakable imprint of a new regime. Maria Alvarez saw the transformation firsthand. Her beloved school, where she had taught for a decade, was no longer hers. The children's laughter was replaced with drills and chants pledging loyalty to Fidel Castro. Miguel spent sleepless nights scouring the radio for news. Underground stations from Miami buzzed with warnings, mixing facts with speculation. A particular rumor sent shivers through his spine: the patria potestad law, supposedly stripping parents of their rights and handing them over to the state. Though unverified, the possibility alone was enough to spark action. One evening, a neighbor whispered about an organization helping children escape to the United States. "They're calling it Operación Pedro Pan," she said, her voice trembling. "Priests are organizing flights. They say it's safe, but it's a risk." Miguel clenched his fists, his thoughts racing. Could they send Daniel away? Could they truly separate from their only son, with no certainty of reunion? Across the Florida Straits, Father Walsh was piecing together the framework of a clandestine rescue mission. With the help of James Baker, a lawyer and fellow advocate for Cuban refugees, he sought ways to secure visas for unaccompanied children. The Cuban government had outlawed immigration without state approval, so each step required delicate coordination. Walsh reached out to the U.S. State Department, leveraging political connections and the growing sympathy for Cuban exiles. "Every child we save is a life spared from the grip of indoctrination," Walsh declared during one of his late-night meetings. But logistical challenges loomed large. Where would the children stay? How would they be cared for once they arrived in Miami? With limited resources and growing demand, Walsh turned to local Catholic charities and foster families willing to take in children who would arrive with little more than a suitcase and a prayer. The Alvarez household grew quiet in the days that followed. Maria and Miguel barely spoke as they grappled with an impossible choice. Sending Daniel to America would mean safety, an escape from the government's tightening grip. But it would also mean separation, weeks, months, perhaps years without seeing his smiling face or hearing his laughter. One evening, Daniel found his parents seated at the kitchen table, their faces drawn with worry. "Why are you sad?" he asked, clutching his wooden toy plane. Maria pulled him close, burying her face in his hair to hide her tears. "We just want you to be safe," she whispered, her voice breaking. Across Cuba, similar scenes unfolded in countless homes. Parents debated the risks and whispered their plans in hushed tones, fearing the ears of informants. Neighbors traded addresses of contacts who could help arrange flights. The idea of sending their children into the unknown haunted them, but the alternative, a life under a regime they couldn't trust, was worse. In Miami, the first wave of Operation Peter Pan was underway. On a humid August morning, the Gonzalez siblings, 14-year-old Anna and her younger brother, Carlos, boarded a Pan Am flight. Their mother had saved for months to bribe officials for travel permits, slipping the children's passports into their hands with trembling fingers. "Be strong," she whispered as tears streamed down her cheeks. As the plane ascended into the sky, Anna gripped Carlos's hand, her heart heavy with a mix of fear and resolve. Father Walsh met the Gonzalez children upon their arrival, offering reassuring words and a warm meal. But he knew their journey was far from over. The children's foster family, the Hernandezes, welcomed them into their modest Miami home, promising safety and care. Yet, for Anna and Carlos, the ache of leaving their mother behind was a wound that no kindness could heal. By late 1960, the trickle of children leaving Cuba under Operation Peter Pan turned into a steady stream. The operation was shrouded in secrecy, its success dependent on discretion. Families passed information through whispered conversations and coded notes, while local priests coordinated with clandestine networks to transport children to the airport. Maria and Miguel Alvarez finally made their decision. One late evening, under the cover of darkness, they traveled to Havana with Daniel. Miguel carried a small suitcase packed with clothes and a notebook where Maria had written down every piece of advice she could think of for her son's journey. "Be polite. Trust the priest who helps you. Remember that we love you," she had scrawled in trembling handwriting. The church in Havana was quiet when they arrived, lit only by candles flickering against the stone walls. Father Manuel, a Cuban priest working closely with Father Walsh, greeted them. "You're doing the right thing," he said, his voice calm but firm. Maria nodded silently, her hand gripping Daniel's as if she would never let go. Meanwhile, in Miami, the Catholic Welfare Bureau was struggling to keep up. For each child that arrived, Walsh and his team scrambled to find temporary housing. Dormitories at Catholic schools overflowed, and foster families were in short supply. But the support of Miami's Cuban exile community grew stronger with each passing day. Families who had lost everything still offered what little they could to help the new arrivals. Despite the challenges, Walsh felt a sense of hope. Each plane landing at Miami International Airport brought not just children, but stories of resilience. The Gonzalez siblings had adjusted to their new life, Anna helping Carlos with his English lessons after school. The letters they received from their mother were bittersweet, filled with reassurances that they would reunite someday. For now, they clung to the promise of a brighter future. As Daniel's plane rose above Havana, Maria watched it disappear into the clouds, her heart breaking into 1,000 pieces. Miguel stood stoic beside her, his jaw clenched tightly, though his eyes glistened with unshed tears. They had made the ultimate sacrifice, entrusting their only son to strangers in a foreign land. In the weeks that followed, Maria threw herself into work, teaching literacy classes to neighborhood children as part of the government's sweeping educational reforms. But the lessons were laced with revolutionary propaganda, and Maria felt like a pawn in a game she no longer believed in. At night, she prayed for Daniel's safety and dreamed of the day they would see him again. Daniel, meanwhile, found himself thrust into a world that was both foreign and overwhelming. At the foster home arranged for him in Miami, he shared a bunk bed with another boy named Ernesto, who had arrived a week earlier. Ernesto was older, quieter, and seemed to know everything about survival. "You'll get used to it," Ernesto said as Daniel stared at the strange new food on his plate, mashed potatoes and meatloaf instead of rice and beans. Father Walsh continued to work tirelessly, though the weight of the operation bore down on him. Late one evening, he reviewed the growing list of children who had arrived safely and those still waiting to board flights. The risks were mounting. The Cuban government had begun tightening controls, and whispers of arrests circulated. Yet Walsh refused to give up. "We have to keep going," he told his team. "Each child is a life saved." Back in Cuba, Miguel joined the underground network helping other families arrange for their children to leave. He knew the risks of being caught but felt it was the least he could do. Every time he saw a mother clutching her child at the church, he was reminded of Maria's tearful goodbye to Daniel. The mission had become personal. The days turned into weeks, and for Maria and Miguel, life became a strange, hollow routine. Each morning, they woke to the sound of revolutionary broadcasts blaring from loudspeakers, proclaiming the victories of Castro's regime. The streets buzzed with rallies and speeches, but for the Alvarez family, the world seemed muted. Their thoughts were thousands of miles away, in Miami, with their son, Daniel. In the Alvarez home, Daniel's room remained untouched. His wooden plane still rested on the shelf, and his books were neatly stacked on the desk. Maria found herself drawn to the room in quiet moments, her fingers tracing the edges of his belongings as if to feel his presence. Miguel, ever practical, focused on his work with the underground network, but even he couldn't hide the pain in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. In Miami, Daniel was slowly adjusting to his new life. His foster family, the Hernandezes, were kind but unfamiliar. Mrs. Hernandez spoke softly and made sure Daniel had everything he needed, but it wasn't the same as his mama. At school, Daniel met other children like him, kids who had left everything behind and carried the weight of their family's hopes on their small shoulders. They whispered to each other in Spanish during recess, sharing stories of home and the dreams they had of returning someday. Father Walsh spent more and more time coordinating with his team to manage the growing influx of children. The operation had become a delicate balancing act. Each flight out of Havana carried not just children but the hopes and fears of countless families. Walsh often found himself at the airport, watching his children disembark, their faces a mixture of relief and confusion. He greeted each one with a warm smile and a reassuring hand on the shoulder, knowing how much courage it took for them to make this journey. As the operation expanded, so did the risks. The Cuban government was growing suspicious of the exodus, and reports of interrogations and arrests began to surface. Miguel, now deeply involved in the network, found himself constantly looking over his shoulder. One evening, as he walked home from a meeting, he noticed a black car trailing him. He ducked into an alley, his heart pounding, and waited until the car disappeared into the night. Maria begged Miguel to stop. "What if they take you? What will I do then?" She pleaded, tears streaming down her face. But Miguel shook his head. "If I can help just one more child escape, it's worth the risk," he said firmly. Maria knew she couldn't change his mind, so she prayed for his safety each night, clutching Daniel's last letter tightly in her hands. In Miami, Daniel's life was beginning to settle into a rhythm. He joined a local soccer team and found solace in the familiar game. But even as he made new friends, the ache of missing his parents never left him. He wrote letters every week, though he wasn't sure when, or if, they would reach them. One day, Father Walsh received a visit from a U.S. government official. The man warned him of the increasing dangers in Cuba and the possibility of the operation being exposed. "If the Cuban government finds out, they could shut it all down," the man said gravely. Walsh nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. But he refused to stop. "These children have nowhere else to go," he said. "We can't abandon them." In Havana, the pressure on families grew with each passing day. Neighbors turned against one another, suspicion creeping into every interaction. Maria avoided eye contact with her coworkers, fearing that even a casual comment could be misconstrued. The walls seemed to have ears, and trust became a luxury few could afford. Miguel's network faced its first major setback when one of their couriers was arrested. The man had been carrying forged travel documents for 3 children scheduled to leave the next day. The news sent shockwaves through the group, and meetings were canceled as members went into hiding. Miguel burned his notebook of contacts and stayed away from the church for weeks, but the fear lingered. In Miami, Daniel's letters to his parents began to carry a different tone. "I miss you," he wrote, "but I am learning so much here. My foster mom says I'm getting better at English. Do you think you'll come here soon?" Each letter was a mixture of hope and longing, but Maria couldn't bring herself to respond. What could she say? That she had no idea when, or if, they would ever see each other again? Father Walsh, too, began to feel the weight of the operation in ways he hadn't expected. The stories of separation, of children torn from their families, weighed heavily on him. One evening, he sat in his office, surrounded by paperwork and letters from parents. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer for strength. "Help me keep them safe," he murmured, his voice barely audible in the quiet room. By early 1961, the Alvarez family's life in Havana became a careful dance of survival. Miguel operated cautiously, avoiding familiar routes and meeting contacts only in public places where anonymity could shield him. Despite the risks, he couldn't abandon the families who came to him, desperate for help. Each successful departure felt like a small victory in a war they were all losing. For Maria, the ache of Daniel's absence grew sharper with every passing day. She held onto his letters like lifelines, reading them over and over until the paper began to wear thin. "I met a boy named Pedro," Daniel wrote in one letter. "He reminds me of you, Mama. He's kind and always shares his lunch with me." Maria smiled through her tears, picturing Daniel's bright eyes and curious nature, even as her heart ached to hold him again. In Miami, Father Walsh faced a new wave of challenges. The children arriving now were younger, some as young as 6, their faces etched with confusion and fear. Walsh worked tirelessly to find homes for them, but the foster families were stretched thin. Resources were dwindling, and the operation's clandestine nature made it difficult to ask for outside help. Daniel, Meanwhile, began to take on the role of a big brother to the newer arrivals. He showed them how to say basic phrases in English and helped them navigate their new world. It's hard at first, he told a tearful boy named Luis, who clutched a photograph of his parents. But we'll make it. You'll see. Yet even as Daniel offered comfort, he carried the weight of his own fears. What if his parents never joined him? One fateful evening, Miguel's underground network was betrayed. A young man, desperate for money, had sold information to the authorities, exposing several key members. Miguel heard the news from a trusted ally just before dawn. They're coming, the man warned, his voice trembling. You need to leave, Miguel. But Miguel refused to abandon Maria. Together, they hastily destroyed any evidence of their involvement in the network, burning documents and hiding incriminating materials. The tension was palpable as they waited, not knowing if, or when, the knock on their door would come. Across the Florida Straits, Father Walsh received a coded message from a contact in Havana. The Cuban government was cracking down on unauthorized immigration, and several children had been detained at the airport. Walsh's heart sank. The stakes had never been higher, and the safety of the operation was now in jeopardy. For Daniel, life in Miami continued, but he noticed the growing tension among the adults around him. Mrs. Hernandez whispered with her husband late at night, and Father Walsh seemed more tired than ever. The children at school began sharing stories of arrests and separations back in Cuba, their voices hushed with fear. Do you think we'll see our parents again? Pedro asked Daniel one afternoon. Daniel didn't know how to answer. In Havana, the Alvarez family's world grew smaller with each passing day. Miguel rarely left the house, and Maria avoided speaking to anyone outside her closest circle. The government's presence was everywhere, armed soldiers patrolling the streets, informants lurking in the shadows. It felt as though the very air was being watched. One evening, as Maria sat by the window, she heard the faint sound of music drifting through the neighborhood. It was a familiar tune, one that Daniel used to hum while playing with his wooden plane. The melody brought a bittersweet ache, a reminder of what they had lost and what they were fighting to protect. In Miami, Father Walsh convened an emergency meeting with his team. We have to adapt, he said, his voice firm despite the exhaustion etched into his features. The operation is at risk, but we can't stop now. These children are counting on us. Plans were made to find alternative routes, bypassing the increasingly hostile Cuban authorities. Daniel, too, began to sense the urgency in the air. One day, he received a package from his parents, a small wooden cross and a note written in Maria's careful handwriting. Stay strong, my son, it read. We love you more than anything in this world. Daniel clutched the cross tightly, a tangible connection to the family he longed to see again. By mid-1961, the pressure on the Alvarez family and others like them was at an all-time high. The crackdown by the Cuban government meant that even the smallest signs of dissent or unauthorized activity could lead to imprisonment. Yet, amidst the suffocating atmosphere, whispers of hope still circulated. One of Miguel's remaining contacts, an elderly man named Tomas, approached him late one evening. There's talk of a new route, Tomas said in a hushed voice. A fishing boat leaving from Playa Huron. It's dangerous, but it might work for families trying to join their children in Miami. Miguel's eyes lit up momentarily, though he knew the risk. We'll think about it, he replied cautiously. In Miami, Father Walsh received a visit from Ana Gonzalez, now 15 years old. She had taken it upon herself to write letters on behalf of the younger children to ensure their parents knew they were safe. You've done so much for us, Anna told Walsh, her voice steady despite her young age. Let me help. Moved by her resilience, Walsh agreed, and Anna became a small but powerful force in the operation, offering comfort and guidance to the children who arrived daily. Meanwhile, Daniel clung to the wooden cross his parents had sent him. At night, he held it close as he whispered prayers for their safety. Bring them here, he prayed, his voice barely audible in the quiet dormitory. The other children noticed his unwavering hope and often turned to him for reassurance. "If Daniel believes, so can we," Pedro would say, echoing his friend's quiet strength. One humid night, Miguel made the decision to risk everything. He and Maria would attempt the dangerous boat route to reunite with Daniel. "We can't stay here while he's out there, waiting for us," Miguel said, his voice resolute. Maria hesitated, fear gripping her heart. "And if we don't make it?" she asked. Miguel took her hand, his voice softening. "We have to try." The days leading up to their departure were filled with silent preparation. Under the cover of darkness, they packed a small bag with essentials, a few clothes, a photograph of Daniel, and a loaf of bread wrapped carefully in cloth. Tomas arranged for them to meet the fisherman, who would guide them to the boat. The night of their escape was fraught with tension. The beach was eerily quiet except for the sound of waves lapping against the shore. The boat was small and weathered, its hull barely large enough to hold the 8 passengers who climbed aboard. Miguel held Maria's hand tightly as the engine sputtered to life. The journey ahead would be treacherous, but the thought of seeing Daniel again gave them strength. In Miami, Daniel had no idea that his parents were on their way. He spent his days helping the younger children and writing letters to Maria and Miguel. "I had a dream about you last night," he wrote in one letter. "You were here, and we were laughing together. I hope it comes true." As the boat carrying Miguel and Maria crossed the Florida Straits, the sea turned against them. Dark clouds rolled in, and the wind howled with a fury that sent waves crashing over the sides of the vessel. The passengers clung to one another, their prayers carried away by the storm. Maria gripped the photograph of Daniel tightly, her knuckles white as the boat rocked violently. "We're going to make it," Miguel shouted over the roar of the wind, though even he wasn't sure. The fishermen fought to steady the vessel, their faces grim with determination. In Miami, Father Walsh knelt in prayer at the chapel. He had learned of the dangerous boat route through his network and knew that more families would risk their lives to reunite with their children. "Guide them safely," he whispered, his voice heavy with emotion. Daniel, too, felt a strange unease that night. He lay awake in his bunk, clutching the wooden cross and staring at the ceiling. For the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of hope, though he didn't know why. "Please let them be safe," he murmured, his voice barely audible in the stillness of the dormitory. The storm raged through the night, but as dawn broke, the winds began to calm. The battered boat, soaked and creaking, drifted steadily toward the Florida coast. Miguel and Maria sat huddled together, their clothes drenched and their faces streaked with salt water. Miguel pointed to the horizon, where a faint line of land was visible against the pale morning sky. "We're almost there," he whispered, though exhaustion weighed down his voice. The fishermen guided the boat into a secluded inlet, away from prying eyes. As the passengers disembarked, they collapsed onto the sandy shore, overwhelmed by a mixture of relief and disbelief. Miguel knelt in the sand, his hands trembling as he clutched the photograph of Daniel. Maria closed her eyes and murmured a prayer of gratitude, the weight of the journey finally sinking in. In Miami, Father Walsh received word that a group of refugees had landed nearby. He wasted no time in dispatching volunteers to assist them. When he arrived, he saw Miguel and Maria among the group. Their faces were lined with fatigue, but their eyes burned with determination. "You've come a long way," Walsh said gently. Miguel nodded, his voice steady. "We need to find our son." Meanwhile, Daniel's days continued as usual. He attended school, helped the younger children, and wrote his weekly letters. But he felt a growing sense of anticipation, as though something important was about to happen. "I don't know why," he told Pedro one afternoon, "but I think we'll see our families again soon." Father Walsh arranged for Miguel and Maria to stay at a temporary shelter while he worked to locate Daniel. The process was painstakingly slow, as the operations records were scattered across various locations to protect their secrecy. Walsh reassured the couple that he would do everything in his power to reunite them with their son. Daniel was at school when Walsh finally tracked him down. The priest arrived at the playground, scanning the group of children until his eyes landed on the boy with the wooden cross around his neck. "Daniel," Walsh called, his voice warm and steady. Daniel looked up, startled, and ran to him. "Is everything okay, Father?" Walsh knelt to meet Daniel's gaze. "I have someone who wants to see you," he said, a smile spreading across his face. Daniel's heart raced as he followed Walsh to the waiting car. The ride felt like an eternity, his mind spinning with possibilities. When they arrived at the shelter, Maria was the first to see him. She froze, her hands flying to her mouth as tears spilled down her cheeks. "Daniel," she cried, running toward him. Miguel stood behind her, his stoic demeanor crumbling as his son threw himself into their arms. They held each other tightly, the weight of separation dissolving in that single, precious moment. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotion for the Alvarez family. For months, they had dreamed of this reunion, and now that it was real, it felt almost surreal. Maria couldn't stop fussing over Daniel, brushing his hair and straightening his clothes. Miguel listened intently as his son recounted stories of his time in Miami, his heart swelling with pride. Daniel, too, struggled to adjust. While he was overjoyed to see his parents, he had grown used to life without them. The foster home, school, and his new friends had become his world. Now, he had to find a way to bridge the gap between the life he had known and the one he had dreamed of. Father Walsh continued his work, though the reunion of the Alvarez family reminded him of the importance of his mission. For every family reunited, there were countless others still separated. The weight of those left behind pressed heavily on his shoulders, but moments like these gave him the strength to carry on. As the days passed, Miguel and Maria began to think about their future in the United States. They had sacrificed everything to come here, and now they needed to rebuild. Miguel found work at a local hardware store, while Maria took a job cleaning offices. It wasn't the life they had left behind in Cuba, but it was a start. Life in Miami was challenging, but the Alvarez family faced it together. Daniel excelled in school, earning praise from his teachers for his resilience and determination. He continued to write letters to his friends who remained in foster care, urging them to stay strong and never lose hope. Miguel and Maria became active in the Cuban exile community, offering support to other families navigating their new lives. They attended weekly gatherings at the local church, where they shared stories, exchanged advice, and found solace in the company of others who understood their struggles. One afternoon, as they sat together at the dinner table, Miguel looked at his family and smiled. "We made it," he said quietly. Maria reached for his hand, her eyes filled with gratitude. "And we'll keep going," she replied. Daniel looked between them, a spark of determination lighting up his face. "We'll be okay," he said firmly. For the first time in months, the Alvarez family felt a sense of peace. The road ahead would not be easy, but they had each other, and that was enough. Operation Success, the CIA-led 1954 coup that overthrew Guatemala's democratically elected government, reshaping Latin America under Cold War pressures. In the heart of Central America lies Guatemala, a land known for its lush landscapes and rich Mayan heritage. But by the early 1950s, the country had become a hotbed of Cold War tensions, where global superpowers clashed over ideology and influence. The stage was set for a dramatic upheaval, a coup d'état that would alter the course of history. This story chronicles the events of the 1954 Guatemalan coup, a tale woven with ambition, fear, and betrayal. It delves into the lives of the individuals who became unwitting players in a global game of power, their fates intertwined with the destiny of a nation. Through their eyes, we witness the unraveling of Guatemala's fragile democracy, offering an intimate perspective on this pivotal chapter of history. The story begins in the late 19th century, when foreign investment poured into Guatemala, transforming its economy and politics. Among the most influential entities was the United Fruit Company, an American corporation with vast holdings in banana plantations. Its influence was so pervasive that it shaped not only the economy but also the government, an alliance that would have far-reaching consequences. In the early 20th century, Guatemala's authoritarian regimes catered to foreign investors, granting them enormous privileges. For the ordinary citizens, however, life was starkly different. The majority of the population, comprising indigenous communities, toiled under exploitative conditions. Land ownership was concentrated in the hands of a few, leaving millions without access to basic resources. Amidst this inequality, a spark of hope emerged in 1944. The overthrow of the dictator Jorge Ubico ushered in the Guatemalan Revolution. Juan José Arevalo, a reformist intellectual, assumed the presidency. His tenure marked the beginning of a new era, as he sought to implement progressive policies, including labor rights and education reforms. Yet, these changes did not sit well with the elite or with the United Fruit Company, which saw its interests threatened. By the time Jacobo Arbenz took office in 1951, the tensions had reached a boiling point. His land reform program, which sought to redistribute uncultivated land to impoverished farmers, was both ambitious and contentious. For the United Fruit Company, it was an existential threat. Behind closed doors, the company lobbied the U.S. government, painting Arbenz as a communist sympathizer. This narrative resonated deeply during the fervor of the Cold War. As dusk fell on Guatemala City, whispers of conspiracy filled the air. The streets, illuminated by flickering lanterns, were alive with a mixture of hope and fear. Arbenz, steadfast in his vision, could not have foreseen the storm that was about to engulf his nation. Across the ocean, in the corridors of power in Washington, plans were being laid, plans that would change Guatemala forever. By the early 1950s, the United States had begun to view Guatemala as a potential Soviet outpost in the Western Hemisphere. The Cold War's binary ideology of us versus them left little room for nuance, and President Jacobo Arbenz's reforms were seen through a lens of suspicion. Arbenz's land reform program, which expropriated uncultivated land from large estates and compensated owners based on declared tax values, became a flashpoint. In Washington, D.C., the United Fruit Company's lobbying efforts gained traction. Key figures in the Eisenhower administration, including Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and CIA Director Allen Dulles, had direct ties to the company. These relationships transformed Guatemala's internal politics into a matter of national security for the United States. Arbenz was branded a communist, and his actions were painted as a direct threat to American interests. The CIA initiated Operation TB Success, a covert plan to overthrow the Arbenz government. The operation's architects aimed to use psychological warfare and a small rebel force to destabilize the government. Propaganda was a critical weapon. Radio broadcasts, leaflets, and false reports were used to spread fear and undermine Arbenz's support. The message was clear: a communist takeover was imminent. Amid this backdrop, ordinary Guatemalans began to feel the weight of external interference. Maria, a school teacher in a rural village, listened to the radio with a mixture of confusion and dread. The broadcast spoke of Soviet agents and guerrilla armies, narratives that felt disconnected from her daily reality. Yet, the seeds of doubt were planted, and uncertainty began to spread among the populace. In the spring of 1954, preparations for the coup intensified. The CIA identified Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas, an exiled Guatemalan military officer, as a potential leader of the rebellion. Castillo Armas was charismatic and fiercely anti-communist, making him an ideal figurehead for the operation. He was supplied with weapons, funding, and a small band of loyal fighters. In Guatemala City, President Arbenz grew increasingly isolated. While he was determined to defend his reforms, his government lacked the resources and international support to counter the growing threat. His military leaders were divided, and some began to waver in their loyalty. Meanwhile, Castillo Armas's forces began staging small incursions along Guatemala's borders. These skirmishes, though limited in scope, were amplified by CIA propaganda, creating the illusion of a widespread rebellion. The airwaves crackled with reports of advancing rebel troops, eroding confidence in Arbenz' government. In the capital, Lorenzo, a young journalist, struggled to discern fact from fiction. He wandered the bustling markets, speaking with merchants and laborers. The stories he heard were fragmented but chilling. Some believed the government was collapsing, others dismissed the rebellion as a distant threat. Lorenzo's pen captured the tension in the air, chronicling the unease that gripped the nation. As Castillo Armas prepared his small force, the CIA's propaganda campaign took on a life of its own. Using a covert radio station, Voice of Liberation, the United States broadcast a steady stream of misinformation. The station claimed that large rebel armies were advancing toward Guatemala City, supported by defecting soldiers from the national military. These broadcasts created chaos and confusion. Farmers in the highlands whispered of troops marching through the jungles, while city dwellers nervously scanned the skies for enemy planes. In reality, the rebels were few in number and poorly equipped. Yet, the psychological impact of the propaganda far outweighed the rebels' actual strength. President Arbenz, aware of the disinformation campaign, struggled to counteract its effects. His government attempted to broadcast its own messages of reassurance, but their reach was limited. Arbenz convened his cabinet in an emergency meeting, his voice heavy with frustration. "They fight us with words and shadows," he said. "How do we fight back?" In a small village near Quetzaltenango, Diego, a coffee farmer, listened intently to the radio. The static-filled voice spoke of impending doom, urging Guatemalans to rise against communism. Diego, skeptical of the claims, tried to reassure his neighbors. But as more families packed their belongings and fled, even his resolve began to waver. As the propaganda campaign escalated, the CIA launched another phase of Operation PD Success. Aircraft painted in Guatemalan Air Force colors flew over rural areas, dropping leaflets and occasionally bombs. These planes, piloted by American contractors, aimed to create the illusion that Guatemala's own military was turning against Arbenz. In Guatemala City, the sound of engines roaring overhead became a daily reminder of the growing crisis. Arbenz's advisors urged him to take decisive action, but options were limited. The president ordered his air force to intercept the planes, but the small and outdated fleet struggled to respond effectively. In one harrowing incident, a bomb fell near a market in Chiclamil. No one was killed, but the explosion sent shockwaves through the town. The market, usually a lively hub of activity, became a scene of fear and chaos. Among the crowd was Anna, a young mother clutching her child. She stared at the plume of smoke, her thoughts racing. Was the government truly falling apart? Were the rebels already at their doorstep? Meanwhile, in the rebel camp, Castillo Armas prepared to capitalize on the confusion. His men, though small in number, were emboldened by the psychological warfare. The plan was working, the government was losing its grip, and the people's faith in Arbenz was crumbling. By June 1954, Guatemala was teetering on the brink. The psychological and physical toll of the coup was evident in every corner of the country. Schools were closed, markets operated under heavy tension, and even the air seemed thick with unease. The streets of Guatemala City were quieter than usual, as people avoided public gatherings out of fear of violence. Within the presidential palace, Arbenz met with his dwindling circle of loyal advisors. Each report painted a bleaker picture. Key military officers were defecting or refusing to act, and the United States had made its stance clear. Arbenz's government had no allies among the global powers. His land reforms, once a beacon of hope, now seemed like a burden too heavy to bear. In the highlands, villagers debated their future. Would the land they had fought so hard to reclaim be lost? Would the rebels, rumored to be advancing, bring destruction in their wake? Among them was Tomas, an elder who had seen decades of political turmoil. He urged caution, reminding his neighbors that rumors often carried more weight than truth. Yet even he could not deny the palpable fear. The coup's final act was approaching, but the question remained, how would it end? Would Arbenz fight to the last, or would he succumb to the mounting pressure? The nation waited, breathless and uncertain, as the storm clouds of conflict gathered overhead. In mid-June 1954, the noose around President Arbenz tightened. Castillo Armas and his modest force of rebels launched incursions along Guatemala's borders, creating the illusion of a widespread uprising. Though the incursions were often repelled, the psychological damage they inflicted was immense. Soldiers who once stood firmly by Arbenz began to waver, unsure if they were defending a doomed regime. In the presidential palace, Arbenz sat at his desk, surrounded by a clutter of reports and maps. The once confident leader now appeared weary and burdened. He knew his military was losing faith. He also recognized the real enemy was not Castillo Armas but the United States, whose influence loomed large over every aspect of the conflict. Among the military ranks, Captain Eduardo Peralta struggled with his loyalty. He had supported the government's reforms, believing they would improve the lives of Guatemala's poorest citizens. But now, faced with rumors of advancing rebels and whispers of betrayal within the army, he questioned whether he could continue to serve. Each night, Eduardo wrote letters to his wife, torn between duty and self-preservation. In the countryside, the psychological toll was profound. Farmers abandoned their fields, leaving crops to wither. Entire villages were gripped by fear, their inhabitants unsure whether to flee or remain. The nation was on edge, a tinderbox waiting for a spark. The United States psychological warfare intensified. The Voice of Liberation radio station broadcast increasingly brazen messages, claiming that Castillo Armas's forces were growing stronger and that defections within the Guatemalan military were widespread. The broadcasts urged citizens to abandon Arbenz and embrace the liberation that the rebels promised. The effect of these messages was devastating. Families in rural areas packed their belongings and fled to the hills, fearing violence. In the capital, panic spread as businesses closed their doors and rumors ran rampant. Each false report of a rebel victory added to the sense of inevitability that Arbenz's government would fall. Meanwhile, the United Fruit Company's media connections ensured that the narrative of Arbenz as a communist puppet reached audiences in the United States and beyond. Headlines in major newspapers framed the Guatemalan crisis as a battle against the spread of Soviet influence, further justifying U.S. intervention. For Lorenzo, the young journalist, the propaganda was both fascinating and infuriating. He penned articles questioning the validity of the rebel claims, but his words were drowned out by the overwhelming tide of misinformation. He began to fear that truth itself was becoming a casualty of the conflict. On June 18, 1954, Castillo Armas launched his most ambitious attack yet, targeting key border towns with his ragtag force. While the actual fighting was minimal, the psychological impact was immense. Arbenz's advisors urged him to declare martial law, but it was too late to stem the tide of fear and death. In Guatemala City, the streets were eerily quiet. Citizens huddled in their homes, listening to the endless drone of propaganda on the radio. Arbenz's once hopeful revolution was crumbling before their eyes. Even his most loyal supporters began to question whether his vision was worth the growing chaos. At a military base near the capital, Eduardo Peralta faced an impossible choice. His commanding officer had defected to Castillo Armas, leaving him to decide whether to follow or remain loyal to Arbenz. Eduardo thought of his wife and young son, wondering if loyalty to a collapsing regime was worth risking their future. By June 27, Arbenz could no longer deny the inevitable. Surrounded by disloyal officers and a country paralyzed by fear, he announced his resignation. In his final address, he spoke with a mixture of defiance and sorrow, condemning the foreign interference that had destroyed Guatemala's fragile democracy. With Arbenz' resignation, Castillo Armas and his forces entered Guatemala City. The liberation they promised quickly gave way to repression. Political opponents were rounded up, and land reforms were reversed, returning power to the elite. The CIA's Operation PB success had achieved its goal, but the cost to Guatemala was immeasurable. For ordinary citizens, the new regime brought little relief. Farmers like Diego found themselves dispossessed once more, their hard-won lands returned to plantation owners. Maria, the school teacher, watched in despair as funding for education dried up. Lorenzo, the journalist, was forced into exile, his voice silenced by the new government. Captain Eduardo Peralta, who had reluctantly joined Castillo Armas, struggled with his decision. Though he had avoided immediate danger, he was haunted by the knowledge that he had abandoned the ideals he once believed in. Guatemala entered a new era, but it was one marked by instability and repression. The coup had ended Arbenz's revolution, but it also sowed the seeds of future conflict, setting the stage for decades of civil war. In the shadows, the ordinary people of Guatemala braced themselves for what was to come. In the weeks following Arbenz's resignation, Guatemala City began to resemble a war zone. Rebel forces paraded through the streets, greeted by a mixture of forced celebration and silent dread. The once hopeful faces of the city's residents were now marked by uncertainty. The promises of liberation from Castillo Armas quickly faded as his regime began consolidating power. In rural villages, fear ruled the day. Farmers who had benefited from the land reforms watched helplessly as soldiers arrived to reclaim their fields for wealthy landowners. Diego, the coffee farmer, tried to remain on his land, but threats from local militias forced him and his family to flee. They sought refuge in the mountains, joining hundreds of displaced families. For Diego, the dream of owning land had become a distant memory. Back in the capital, Maria, the school teacher, returned to her classroom. She found it nearly empty. Many families had fled, and others had withdrawn their children out of fear of political reprisals. Maria's voice cracked as she recited lessons to the handful of students who remained, her heart heavy with the knowledge that their future was slipping away. Castillo Armas's government wasted no time in dismantling the reforms of the Arbenz administration. The land redistribution program was reversed, with confiscated plots returned to their former owners, including the United Fruit Company. Labor unions were outlawed, and political opponents faced imprisonment or worse. The regime's actions sent a clear message: dissent would not be tolerated. Eduardo Peralta, now a captain in Castillo Armas's military, found himself patrolling the streets of Guatemala City. He witnessed firsthand the brutal crackdowns on protesters and suspected communists. Though he had joined the new regime to protect his family, Eduardo felt a growing sense of guilt. The ideals he had once fought for seemed irretrievably lost. Lorenzo, the journalist, went into hiding. His articles criticizing the coup had made him a target, and he feared arrest, or worse. He relied on a network of sympathetic friends to move between safe houses. Each night, he wrote in a secret journal, chronicling the repression that had descended upon his country. He dreamed of publishing his words one day, hoping they would serve as a record of the truth. While Castillo Armas's government tightened its grip, resistance began to take shape in the shadows. Small groups of dissidents organized clandestine meetings, discussing ways to fight back against the new regime. Among them were disillusioned former Arbenz supporters, students, and labor leaders. In a remote mountain village, Diego and his family found a fragile sense of community among other displaced farmers. Together, they shared stories of their struggles and dreams of reclaiming their land. Diego, though weary and disheartened, began to see a glimmer of hope in their unity. The seeds of resistance were taking root. Maria, too, found ways to resist. She began teaching her students about the importance of standing up for their rights, weaving lessons of resilience and courage into her curriculum. Though she knew the risks, Maria believed education was a powerful weapon against oppression. Eduardo, still grappling with his role in the regime, secretly aided families fleeing government reprisals. He used his position to forge travel papers and arrange safe passage for those at risk. Each act of defiance felt like a small redemption, though he knew it could cost him everything. As months turned into years, Guatemala remained under the oppressive rule of Castillo arms. The government's reliance on fear and violence kept dissent at bay, but the seeds of resistance continued to grow. Young students and displaced farmers whispered of rebellion, their voices becoming stronger despite the risks. For Lorenzo, life in hiding became a routine of constant vigilance. He continued documenting the atrocities of the regime, determined to preserve the truth. His writings, smuggled out of the country by sympathetic allies, began to reach international audiences, exposing the brutality of the coup and its aftermath. Diego, now a leader among the displaced farmers, began organizing small acts of defiance. These included sabotaging supply lines and staging protests in nearby towns. Though their efforts were met with harsh reprisals, Diego believed their resistance would inspire others to join the fight. In Guatemala City, Maria quietly expanded her influence. She connected with underground networks of activists, using her school as a meeting place for those seeking refuge and solidarity. Her efforts provided a lifeline for many, even as the risks to her own safety grew. Eduardo, torn between his duty and his conscience, faced a moment of reckoning. As he witnessed the growing resistance, he realized that his loyalty to the regime was unsustainable. He began to question whether he could find redemption by joining the movement against the very forces he once served. By early 1956, Castillo Armas's government began to show signs of strain. The initial support from powerful landowners and foreign allies had started to waver. The promises of prosperity and stability had not materialized, and the cracks in the regime became more apparent with each passing month. Corruption and mismanagement plagued the administration, further eroding its legitimacy. In rural areas, the displaced farmers grew bolder in their defiance. Diego, now a respected leader among the resistance, helped organize covert meetings to discuss strategy. They spoke in hushed tones under the cover of darkness, mapping out plans for small but symbolic acts of resistance. Diego knew their efforts were modest, but they carried the promise of a larger movement to come. Maria's quiet acts of defiance did not go unnoticed. Her school had become a hub for local activism, and she was under increasing surveillance by government informants. Yet Maria remained steadfast, refusing to abandon her students or her mission. She believed that the children she taught could one day become the leaders of a freer Guatemala. Eduardo's internal conflict reached a boiling point. Witnessing the regime's brutality firsthand had changed him. He began secretly supplying information to the resistance, passing along details about military operations and patrols. Each act of betrayal against the regime felt like a step toward reclaiming his honor. As resistance activities intensified, international attention slowly turned back to Guatemala. Lorenzo's smuggled writings had reached sympathetic journalists and human rights organizations abroad. Reports of repression and human suffering began to circulate, painting a stark picture of life under Castillo Armas's rule. This shift in public opinion emboldened dissidents within Guatemala. Farmers, students, and workers began to join the growing resistance networks, inspired by stories of defiance and resilience. Diego's group expanded, drawing recruits from nearby villages. Their newfound numbers allowed them to plan more ambitious actions, including sabotage of key infrastructure. In the capital, Maria took comfort in the growing momentum of the resistance. She began working with underground activists to distribute pamphlets, spreading messages of hope and solidarity. Despite the constant threat of discovery, Maria found strength in the knowledge that her efforts were making a difference. For Eduardo, the stakes grew higher. His actions had not gone unnoticed, and whispers of disloyalty reached the ears of his superiors. He knew it was only a matter of time before he would be exposed. Still, he continued to aid the resistance, driven by a sense of purpose he had not felt in years. The fragile balance of Castillo Armas's regime was shattered in July 1957, when the president was assassinated under mysterious circumstances. The assassination sent shockwaves through the country, plunging it into political chaos. Rival factions within the government vied for power, while the resistance saw an opportunity to expand their influence. In the countryside, Diego and his fellow leaders debated how to capitalize on the turmoil. They decided to escalate their actions, targeting government supply lines and communication networks. Each act of sabotage was a reminder that the regime's grip on power was weakening. Maria faced increasing danger as the political situation deteriorated. Government crackdowns intensified, and informants were everywhere. One evening, her school was raided by soldiers searching for evidence of her involvement with the resistance. Though they found nothing, Maria knew her time in the city was running out. She made the difficult decision to flee to the mountains, where she hoped to continue her work in safety. Eduardo's situation also grew more precarious. The chaos within the military created opportunities for defection, but it also increased the likelihood of betrayal. He decided to take a decisive step, contacting Diego's group to offer his skills and knowledge. The former captain, once an instrument of the regime, now sought redemption through the resistance. As 1958 dawned, Guatemala stood at a crossroads. The power vacuum left by Castillo Armas's assassination had not been filled, leaving the country deeply divided. A series of short-lived governments struggled to maintain order, while the resistance gained ground in rural areas and among urban activists. Diego welcomed Eduardo into the movement with cautious optimism. The former military officer brought valuable knowledge of the regime's tactics and weaknesses, but his past affiliation made some resistance members wary. Eduardo worked tirelessly to prove his loyalty, leading several successful operations that bolstered the group's morale. Maria found solace in the mountains, where she joined a growing network of educators and organizers. Together, they established makeshift schools and safe havens for displaced families. Maria's quiet determination inspired those around her, and her reputation as a leader grew. Lorenzo, still in hiding, continued his work as the resistance's chronicler. His writings, now reaching a global audience, became a rallying cry for Guatemalans yearning for freedom. Each account of bravery and sacrifice added fuel to the growing fire of rebellion. The stage was set for a new chapter in Guatemala's struggle. The resistance was no longer a scattered collection of dissidents. It was becoming a movement with the potential to reshape the nation. But the road ahead remained perilous, with countless lives hanging in the balance. By mid-1958, the resistance began consolidating its efforts. What had once been scattered groups of dissidents coalesced into a more coordinated movement. Leaders like Diego and Maria worked tirelessly to unify factions, fostering a sense of purpose among the farmers, students, and laborers who joined their ranks. Eduardo's military expertise proved invaluable. He trained the resistance fighters in guerrilla tactics, teaching them to navigate the rugged terrain that had become their refuge. Despite his initial skepticism, Diego came to trust Eduardo, recognizing his genuine commitment to the cause. The two men often strategized late into the night, their shared vision strengthening their bond. In the mountains, Maria's makeshift schools became hubs of hope and resilience. Children learned to read and write by day, while their parents attended meetings to discuss the future of their communities. Maria's voice carried through the valleys, a beacon of quiet defiance against the oppressive regime. Meanwhile, Lorenzo's writings continued to inspire. Smuggled out of the country and published abroad, his vivid accounts of the resistance's struggles and triumphs garnered international sympathy. Human rights organizations began pressuring foreign governments to reconsider their support for Guatemala's oppressive rulers. The resistance decided it was time to act decisively. Eduardo proposed an ambitious plan to target a key government supply depot in the Western Highlands. The depot's destruction would not only disrupt military operations but also serve as a powerful symbol of the resistance's strength. Under cover of darkness, a small group of fighters, led by Diego and Eduardo, approached the depot. The mission was fraught with danger, and every step through the dense jungle carried the risk of discovery. Maria and others waited anxiously in a nearby village, tending to supplies and preparing to treat any wounded. The attack was swift and precise. Eduardo's knowledge of the depot's layout allowed the group to strike with minimal casualties. Explosions lit up the night sky as the depot was engulfed in flames. The fighters retreated into the mountains, their hearts pounding with adrenaline and triumph. News of the attack spread quickly, amplified by Lorenzo's network. The people of Guatemala, long cowed into submission, began to believe that change was possible. The regime responded with increased crackdowns, but the resistance's success had already sown the seeds of hope. The government's response to the depot attack was brutal. Soldiers swept through nearby villages, arresting or executing anyone suspected of aiding the resistance. Maria's school narrowly escaped the raid, thanks to a warning from a sympathetic villager. She and her students fled deeper into the mountains, their belongings carried on their backs. Eduardo grappled with guilt over the retaliation, though Diego reassured him that their actions had been necessary. They strike harder because they're afraid, Diego said. That means we're making a difference. In the capital, dissent simmered just below the surface. Workers staged small strikes, students organized secret protests, and Lorenzo's writings found their way into the hands of those willing to risk reading them. The regime's control was slipping, and the resistance capitalized on every opportunity to weaken its grip. Maria's determination grew stronger in the face of adversity. She established new schools in remote villages, where she taught children and adults alike about their rights and the power of collective action. Her work became a cornerstone of the resistance, empowering communities to stand together. By 1959, the resistance movement had gained significant momentum. Diego, Eduardo, and Maria became symbols of hope for a population desperate for change. Their actions inspired new recruits, and the resistance's ranks swelled. Eduardo took on a leadership role, coordinating operations across multiple regions. His strategic mind and military discipline earned him the respect of fighters and civilians alike. Despite the growing dangers, Eduardo felt a renewed sense of purpose, his past sins slowly giving way to a future worth fighting for. Diego continued to rally the farmers, urging them to see their struggle as part of a larger fight for justice. He led raids on government outposts, securing much-needed supplies for the resistance. Each victory, no matter how small, strengthened their resolve. Maria's influence extended far beyond the mountains. Her network of educators spread her teachings throughout the country, turning villages into bastions of resistance. Though she remained a target of the regime, Maria's courage inspired others to take up the fight. Lorenzo, still in hiding, marveled at the transformation of his homeland. His words had played a part in awakening the nation, and he vowed to continue chronicling the resistance's journey. He knew the road ahead would be perilous, but for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope. Operation Flip-Flop. The sun dipped below the horizon of Angola, casting long shadows over the scrubland. It was July 1980, and tensions between South Africa and SWAPO, Southwest African People's Organization, had reached a fever pitch. The land was dry and unforgiving, much like the political climate that had simmered for decades, now threatening to erupt once more. On the dusty plains, the whispers of an imminent conflict rustled through the brittle grass. For years, the South African Defense Force, SADF, had battled insurgencies, navigating the treacherous terrain of border politics and guerrilla warfare. Operation Flip-Flop was the latest gambit in this prolonged struggle. It was a high-stakes maneuver designed to strike at the heart of SWAPO's operations. Intelligence reports suggested a significant presence near the Angolan border, a staging ground for insurgents seeking to cross into southwest Africa, modern-day Namibia. Among the troops preparing for the operation was Captain Pieter van Zyl, a seasoned officer known for his composure under pressure. He had seen many battles and bore the scars, both physical and emotional. His men respected his quiet resolve, even as the weight of leadership bore heavily on him. Nearby, Corporal Thimba and Kosi checked his rifle with steady hands, the flickering campfire casting dancing shadows on his determined face. Thimba, like many others, had joined the fight not out of loyalty to the regime but to survive and protect his family. As the moon rose, illuminating the barren expanse, the troops received their orders. The mission was clear: infiltrate Angola under the cover of darkness, neutralize enemy forces, and return without casualties. It sounded straightforward, but everyone knew the risks. The silence of the night was punctuated only by the distant howls of jackals, a haunting reminder of the dangers that lay ahead. The convoy moved under the cover of darkness, its engines humming softly to avoid detection. The dirt roads leading toward Chitata were rough and uneven, causing the soldiers to grip their weapons tightly as the vehicles jolted and swayed. The landscape around them was eerily still, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the cool night breeze. Captain Pieter van Zyl rode in the lead vehicle, his eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of movement. Thimba and Kosi sat in the back of the second truck, his heart beating in rhythm with the vehicle's vibration. He could feel the tension in the air, a collective unease shared by every man in the convoy. It wasn't just the possibility of an ambush that gnawed at them. It was the weight of the mission. "Keep your eyes open," whispered Private Johan Visser, one of Thimba's closest comrades. Johan's voice was steady, but his knuckles whitened as he gripped his rifle. As they approached the outskirts of Chitata, the convoy came to a halt. Pieter dismounted silently and signaled his men to spread out. The moonlight was faint, but it was enough to illuminate the village ahead. According to intelligence, SWAPO fighters were stationed here, using the settlement as a base of operations. The soldiers moved cautiously, their boots crunching softly on the dry ground. Suddenly, a faint glow appeared in the distance, a fire burning in the village center. Pieter raised his hand, and the troops froze. Through the binoculars, he could see silhouettes moving around the fire. They appeared relaxed, unaware of the danger creeping closer. Pieter turned to his men, his voice low but firm. "This is it. Remember the plan. In and out, no unnecessary risks." The men nodded, their expressions hardening as the reality of combat loomed near. The first shots rang out, shattering the silence. Chaos erupted as SWAPO fighters scrambled for their weapons. The SADF soldiers moved with precision, sweeping through the village like a shadowy tide. Thimba's heart raced as he fired his rifle, the recoil jarring his shoulder. Johan was at his side, shouting instructions over the cacophony of gunfire. Pieter led the charge, his voice calm but commanding. "Clear the perimeter. Watch your flanks." His years of experience were evident as he coordinated the assault, ensuring his men stayed focused and disciplined. The SWAPO fighters fought back fiercely, their determination to defend their stronghold evident. In the midst of the firefight, Thimba found himself cornered behind a crumbling wall. Bullets whizzed past, kicking up dust and splinters of wood. He could hear Johan shouting his name from somewhere nearby, but the noise drowned out the words. Taking a deep breath, Thimba steadied his aim and fired, his shots finding their mark. The immediate threat neutralized, he pushed forward to rejoin his squad. After what felt like hours but was only minutes, the gunfire subsided. The village was silent once more, save for the crackling of the abandoned fire. Pieter surveyed the scene, his face grim. The mission was a success. Several SWAPO fighters were eliminated, and vital supplies were destroyed. Yet, the sight of the lifeless bodies lying in the dust was a sobering reminder of the cost of war. The soldiers regrouped in the village square, their breaths heavy and faces smeared with sweat and dust. The firefight had been brief but intense, leaving behind the echoes of chaos. Captain Pieter van Zyl stood at the center, his eyes scanning the surroundings for any signs of danger. Though the mission had been deemed a success, Pieter knew better than to let his guard down. In war, a moment of complacency could mean disaster. Thimba and Kosi crouched near a smoldering fire, his rifle resting against his knee. The adrenaline that had propelled him moments earlier was now ebbing, replaced by the weight of what had just transpired. Around him, fellow soldiers moved silently, collecting supplies and checking the bodies of the fallen for intelligence. It was a grim task, but one they had grown accustomed to. "You did well," Johann Visser said quietly, placing a hand on Thimba's shoulder. Thimba nodded, though his mind lingered on the faces of the men he had killed. The radio crackled to life, breaking the tense silence. A message from command: they were to withdraw immediately. The risk of enemy reinforcements was too great to linger. Peter relayed the orders, his voice steady despite the fatigue etched into his features. The men began to pack their gear, their movements quick but methodical. The village, once a hive of activity, was now a ghostly shadow of its former self, a casualty of a conflict it had little control over. As the convoy moved away from Chitato under the cover of darkness, Peter allowed himself a brief moment to reflect. The operation had been successful, no casualties on their side, and the enemy had been dealt a significant blow. Yet, the unease in his chest remained. For every skirmish they won, it seemed the war itself grew no closer to an end. The convoy crossed the border back into southwest Africa, the familiar sight of arid terrain bringing a small measure of relief. They reached their temporary base just before dawn, greeted by the sight of comrades standing guard. The soldiers dismounted one by one, their faces a mix of exhaustion and quiet pride. Inside the camp, the atmosphere was subdued, the victory tempered by the understanding of its impermanence. Corporal Thimba Nkosi sat on the edge of his cot, his hands trembling as he lit a cigarette. The memories of the night's battle played over and over in his mind, each gunshot and cry etched into his consciousness. Across the room, Johann leaned against the wall, his own face shadowed by a somber expression. "It doesn't get easier," Johann said finally, breaking the silence. "But it's what we signed up for." Thimba nodded but said nothing, the words offering little solace. Meanwhile, Captain Peter van Zyl met with his commanding officer to deliver the after-action report. The general listened intently, his face expressionless as Peter described the operation's details. "Well done," the general said at last. "But be prepared. Intelligence indicates increased Swapo activity in the region. This war is far from over." Peter saluted and left the tent, his mind already turning to the challenges ahead. As the first rays of sunlight pierced the horizon, the camp stirred to life. Soldiers prepared for the day ahead, their movements a mix of routine and anticipation. The stillness of the morning was deceptive, a brief respite before the inevitability of the next mission. In the distance, the sounds of a desert dawn filled the air, birds calling, the rustle of wind over dry earth. For now, there was peace, but everyone knew it was fleeting. As the camp returned to a semblance of normalcy, the soldiers resumed their routines. Some wrote letters to loved ones, while others shared stories over steaming cups of coffee. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. Every man knew that their next assignment could come at any moment. The war waited for no one. Thimba and Kosi joined a small group sitting under a makeshift canopy, seeking a moment of reprieve. Johann was there, along with a few others who had been in Chitato. The conversation was light-hearted, an attempt to chase away the weight of the night before. Yet, every so often, someone's gaze would wander to the horizon, as though expecting the enemy to materialize from the haze. Inside the command tent, Peter van Zyl stood over a large map spread across the table. The latest intelligence suggested that Swapo forces were regrouping near Rakana, a vital point along the border. The terrain was rugged, a mix of rocky outcrops and dense bush that offered ample cover for guerrilla fighters. Peter traced a finger along the map, considering the possibilities. Later that evening, as the camp settled into the stillness of night, whispers began to circulate. Rumors of a major offensive by Swapo spread like wildfire, fueled by fragments of intercepted radio communications. Peter convened his officers, his voice steady as he addressed their concerns. "We prepare for the worst," he said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. If they come, we'll be ready. The next day dawned with an air of urgency. The camp was a hive of activity as soldiers checked their weapons, loaded supplies, and fortified their positions. Trucks arrived with fresh ammunition and provisions, their arrival a welcome sight amid the growing tension. Training drills resumed in earnest, the men sharpening their skills under the watchful eyes of their commanders. Peter spent hours reviewing the defense plan with his officers, mapping out strategies for every possible scenario. The base's location near Rawkana gave them a strategic advantage, but it was also vulnerable to surprise attacks. Peter's focus was unshakable as he worked to ensure that every soldier knew their role. Among the troops, Thimba felt a mix of anxiety and determination. He practiced tirelessly, determined to be ready for whatever lay ahead. Johann joined him during the drills, offering encouragement and advice. "It's about staying calm," Johann said. "The moment you panic, you lose." Thimba nodded, taking the words to heart. As night fell, the camp was bathed in the pale glow of moonlight. Soldiers gathered in small groups, their conversations subdued. Some spoke of home, reminiscing about families and lives left behind. Others sat in silence, their thoughts turned inward. For Thimba, the night felt heavier than usual, as though the very air carried the weight of what was to come. It was just before dawn when the first signs of trouble appeared. A distant rumble echoed across the plains, faint but distinct. Peter van Zyl stood at the edge of the camp, his keen ears picking up the anomaly. He signaled for silence, and the soldiers around him froze, their breaths held. The rumble grew louder, accompanied by the faint hum of engines. Through his binoculars, Peter spotted a convoy of vehicles on the horizon. Dust rose behind them, a clear indication of movement toward their position. His heart quickened, but his face remained composed. "Prepare for contact," he ordered, his voice cutting through the stillness. The camp sprang to life as soldiers rushed to their positions, weapons ready and adrenaline coursing through their veins. Thimba Nkosi crouched behind a barricade, his rifle steady in his hands. Beside him, Johann Visser whispered, "Stay calm, remember your training." Thimba nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours as the convoy approached, the tension almost unbearable. Suddenly, the convoy veered off, disappearing behind a ridge. The camp remained on high alert, every soldier watching and waiting. Peter knew this could be a feint, a tactic to probe their defenses. He ordered a reconnaissance patrol to investigate, their mission fraught with uncertainty. As the patrol disappeared into the distance, the camp settled into an uneasy silence, the anticipation of conflict hanging heavy in the air. The reconnaissance patrol returned hours later, their faces grim. They reported signs of enemy encampments not far from the ridge, confirming Peter's suspicions. Swapo forces were preparing for an offensive. With this knowledge, Peter called an emergency meeting with his officers. The decision was unanimous, they had to strike first. Under the cover of night, the SADF launched their counter-operation. Moving swiftly through the dense bush, the soldiers relied on their training and the cover of darkness to maintain the element of surprise. Thimba and Johann moved as part of a small unit tasked with securing a key position overlooking the enemy camp. As they approached, the air grew tense. The sound of voices and the glow of campfires confirmed the enemy's presence. Peter signaled for his men to hold their positions. At his command, the first shots were fired, shattering the night and plunging the enemy camp into chaos. Swapo fighters scrambled to respond, but the SADF had the advantage. Thimba found himself in the thick of the fight, his senses heightened by the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Johann was by his side, shouting orders and firing with precision. The skirmish was intense but brief, the SADF's superior planning and coordination overwhelming the enemy. When the dust settled, the camp was silent once more. The mission was a success, but the sight of the fallen left a sobering mark on every soldier present. As dawn broke, the soldiers surveyed the aftermath of the skirmish. Smoke curled into the pale morning sky from the remnants of Swapo's campfires. Captain Pieter van Zyl moved among his men, his expression unreadable. Though the operation had been a success, the sight of destruction and loss weighed heavily on everyone. Even victory could not erase the somber reality of war. Themba Nkosi sat on a fallen log, his rifle resting across his knees. He replayed the battle in his mind, the flashes of gunfire, the cries of men caught in the chaos. Johann Visser approached, offering him a canteen. "You did well, Themba," Johann said, his voice quiet. Themba nodded, though he didn't feel victorious. The cost of their success lingered in his thoughts. As the soldiers regrouped and prepared to return to base, Pieter received a radio transmission from command. The enemy's presence in the area was more extensive than initially believed. Nearby Swapo forces had been alerted by the skirmish and could retaliate at any moment. The journey back to camp would be fraught with danger. The convoy set out under the rising sun, the men on high alert. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every sound a potential ambush. The bushveld, so still and beautiful, now felt like an ominous expanse. For Themba and his comrades, survival depended on vigilance and trust in each other, a fragile lifeline in the uncertainty of war. The convoy snaked its way through a narrow valley, the towering cliffs on either side casting long shadows. It was the perfect spot for an ambush, and Pieter knew it. He ordered the vehicles to proceed cautiously, their occupants scanning the cliffs with keen eyes. The air was thick with tension, the soldiers gripping their weapons tightly. Halfway through the valley, the first shot rang out, followed by a deafening explosion. The lead vehicle was hit, its tires shredded by a landmine. Chaos erupted as Swapo fighters opened fire from the ridges above, their positions concealed among the rocks and brush. The soldiers scrambled for cover, returning fire as they sought to regroup. Themba and Johann dove behind a boulder, bullets ricocheting off the rocks around them. "We're pinned," Johann shouted over the din. Themba nodded, his heart pounding as he fired into the ridgeline. Pieter's voice crackled over the radio, issuing commands with a calmness that steadied his men. "Hold your positions." Suppressing fire on the left flank. The fight dragged on, the SADF soldiers slowly gaining the upper hand. Their training and discipline proved decisive as they coordinated their response. One by one, the enemy positions were silenced. When the gunfire finally ceased, the valley fell eerily quiet. The ambush had been repelled, but the scars it left, on men and machinery, were stark reminders of the peril they faced. The aftermath of the ambush left the convoy shaken but alive. The lead vehicle was beyond repair, its twisted frame a stark symbol of the attack's ferocity. Captain Pieter van Zyl worked quickly, organizing his men to salvage what they could from the wreck. Supplies were redistributed, and the wounded were tended to with care. Themba Nkosi stood watch as others worked, his hands still trembling from the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Johann Visser joined him, his face pale but resolute. "They underestimated us," Johann said, trying to inject some confidence into the tense atmosphere. Themba nodded, his eyes scanning the cliffs above for any lingering threats. Pieter gave the order to move, the remaining vehicles forming a tighter formation as they navigated the treacherous terrain. Every soldier was on high alert, their eyes darting from shadow to shadow, their fingers resting on the triggers. The journey was slow, the tension palpable, but they pressed on. As the convoy finally emerged from the valley, a collective sigh of relief rippled through the ranks. Ahead lay the open plains, offering the soldiers a sense of freedom after the claustrophobic cliffs. Pieter, however, remained cautious. He knew the war was unpredictable, and the safety of the plains could easily turn into a battlefield. The convoy reached a small outpost near the border as the sun began to set. The soldiers disembarked, their faces marked by exhaustion and relief. The outpost was modest but secure, a welcome haven after the harrowing events of the day. Pieter immediately began coordinating with the outpost commander to prepare for potential retaliatory strikes from Swapo. Themba and Johann sat by a fire, the warmth soothing their frayed nerves. "Do you ever think about what comes after this?" Themba asked quietly, staring into the flames. Johann paused, considering the question. Sometimes, he replied. But it feels so far away. Right now, I just want to survive. In the command tent, Peter and the officers pored over maps and reports. Intelligence confirmed that Swapo forces were regrouping, likely planning their next move. The decision was made to reinforce the outpost and prepare for a possible assault. Every soldier understood the gravity of the situation. Their resolve would be tested again, perhaps sooner than they anticipated. As night fell, the outpost settled into a tense quiet. Soldiers took turns on watch, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. The stars above seemed indifferent to the struggles below, their light faint against the vast darkness. For Peter, Themba, Johann, and the rest of the men, the war was not just a battle of weapons but a test of endurance, resilience, and will. The quiet of the night was deceptive. The men at the outpost moved like shadows, their voices hushed as they prepared defenses. Sandbags were stacked higher, and machine gun nests fortified. Every soldier carried an extra clip of ammunition, and their eyes, bloodshot from fatigue, never strayed far from the horizon. Themba and Kosi stood on the eastern perimeter, his rifle resting in the crook of his arm. Johann Visser was a few meters away, scanning the darkness with binoculars. Anything? Themba asked softly. Johann shook his head but kept his gaze steady. Not yet. But they're out there. You can feel it. Inside the command tent, Captain Peter Van Zyl conferred with his officers. The latest intelligence pointed to increased Swapo radioactivity, likely coordinating an attack. Peter's face was calm, but his mind raced through contingency plans. The outpost was well defended, but the sheer unpredictability of guerrilla warfare meant no plan was foolproof. Shortly after midnight, the first flare shot into the sky, bathing the landscape in harsh, white light. It was followed by a sharp whistle, mortar fire. Explosions erupted on the northern edge of the camp, and chaos broke out. Peter emerged from the tent, barking orders as soldiers scrambled to their positions. The siege had begun. Themba felt the ground shake as the first mortars landed. He dropped to a knee, raising his rifle and scanning the darkness for targets. Johann shouted over the din, "They're coming. Get ready." Moments later, gunfire erupted from the brush, and silhouettes of Swapo fighters appeared against the glow of the flares. The outpost's defenses roared to life. Machine guns rattled, their tracers cutting through the night. The sharp crack of rifles echoed across the plains as soldiers returned fire with disciplined precision. Themba fired in bursts, his training kicking in as he aimed for the advancing enemy. Nearby, Johann covered his flank, shouting warnings and encouragement. Peter moved along the line, his presence a steadying force for his men. He coordinated artillery support and ensured reinforcements were sent to weak points in the defenses. The Swapo fighters were relentless, using the terrain to their advantage, but the outpost held firm. The battle raged for hours, the night illuminated by flashes of gunfire and explosions. Slowly, the enemy assault began to falter. By dawn, the gunfire had subsided, and the attackers retreated into the bush. The outpost had withstood the onslaught, but the cost was evident in the weary faces of the men and the smoke rising from the battered defenses. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the outpost was eerily silent. The once busy defensive line was now littered with spent shell casings and the faint smell of gunpowder. Soldiers moved cautiously, scanning the terrain for any signs of a renewed attack. For now, the Swapo fighters had retreated, leaving the battlefield to the weary defenders. Themba and Kosi sat with his back against a sandbag wall, his rifle resting beside him. His hands trembled slightly, the adrenaline from the night's battle still coursing through his veins. Johann Visser approached, his face pale but relieved. "We made it," he said, offering Themba a canteen of water. Themba nodded silently, taking a sip and letting the cool liquid soothe his parched throat. Captain Peter Van Zyl walked among the men, offering words of encouragement. He knew the importance of morale, especially after such an intense engagement. In the command tent, Peter reviewed the situation with his officers. The outpost had held, but it was clear that Swapo would not give up easily. Reinforcements and supplies were needed urgently if they were to maintain their position. As the sun climbed higher, the camp slowly began to stir. The wounded were tended to with care, and repairs to the defenses commenced. The men moved with a sense of purpose, knowing that the reprieve was temporary. The war was far from over, and they had only survived one battle in a much larger campaign. By midday, a radio message crackled through the static in the command tent. Intelligence had pinpointed the location of a key Swapo supply depot deep in the Angolan bush. Destroying it would deal a significant blow to the enemy's ability to sustain operations. Peter listened intently, weighing the risks of such a mission. The order came through quickly. A small, mobile unit would be dispatched to carry out the raid. Peter selected his best men for the task, including Themba and Johann. The two soldiers prepared in silence, their minds focused on the challenge ahead. Johann broke the quiet with a wry smile. Another day, another fight. Themba chuckled despite himself, the shared humor of brief respite from the weight of their reality. The unit set out at dusk, moving swiftly and quietly through the bush. Every step was calculated, the men relying on their training and instincts to navigate the rugged terrain. Peter led from the front, his sharp eyes scanning for signs of enemy activity. The depot was their target, but the path to it was fraught with danger. As night fell, the team reached a vantage point overlooking the depot. Fires burned in the clearing below, illuminating stacks of crates and parked vehicles. Peter gave the signal, and the men prepared for the assault. The quiet of the night was about to be shattered once again.